Sabrina Vale did not walk into Matteo Deverio's life. She was placed there. The night Matteo handed Elena the divorce papers, Sabrina was already in the next room, champagne glass raised, laughing at something his attorney said. Elena heard that laugh through the wall. She heard it, looked down at the papers in her hands, and understood everything she had refused to understand for months. She did not cry. She did not beg. She signed. Matteo told himself that was proof Elena never really loved him. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about almost everything. But a man like Matteo Deverio does not discover how wrong he is until 3 children are staring up at him from across a ballroom, and one of them says, "Dad, Mom said you'd come back." If you've ever loved someone who couldn't see your worth until it was too late, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel and follow until the very last scene, because the ending of this one will hit you somewhere you weren't expecting. And while you're here, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The charity event was held on the 43rd floor of a building that overlooked Lake Michigan like it owned the water. And in Chicago, in the particular circles that mattered, the Deverio family did own quite a lot. Matteo arrived 11 minutes late, which in his world was a form of communication. Men like him did not apologize for time. They redistributed it. His security detail peeled off at the elevator, trained well enough to become invisible the moment he entered a room, and Matteo moved through the crowd the way he always had, not aggressively, not with performance, but with the particular stillness of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to make an entire room pay attention. He shook 4 hands in the first 2 minutes, declined a drink, accepted a folder from his attorney, glanced at 3 numbers on the top page, and passed it back without expression. The charity itself was one Elena had once organized. He hadn't thought about that until he was already inside. He stood near the far windows for a while, letting the skyline do what it always did, absorb whatever was happening in his chest and reflect back nothing. The ice in his glass melted. He didn't drink it. Across the room, near a table stacked with auction bid sheets, he heard arguing. Not adult arguing. Children he turned without meaning to. 3 kids stood in a loose cluster near the table, all of them approximately the same height, all of them gesturing at each other with the controlled outrage that only siblings can produce. A boy in a dark jacket was pointing at something on the table. A girl in a rust-colored dress had her arms crossed and her chin up, the way someone does when they've already decided they're right and are simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. The third child, another boy, stood slightly apart from the other 2, watching the argument with the patient expression of someone who'd seen this exact fight 1,100 times. There was nothing unusual about children at a charity function. But something made Matteo look twice, then a third time. The boy in the dark jacket turned his head, and Matteo went completely still. Because the kid had his face, not approximately, not in some vague, flattering stranger-on-the-street way. The jaw, the line of the brow, the particular way the boy's eyes moved when he was irritated, scanning left, then settling. Matteo had seen that specific expression in mirrors his entire life. He had never seen it on anyone else, until right now. 3 times at once, he set his glass down on the nearest surface without looking at it. The boy in the dark jacket looked up from the table and found Matteo staring. He did not look away. He did not do what most children do when a large, formally dressed adult makes prolonged eye contact. He did not shrink. He stood straighter. Then he walked forward. The girl and the quieter boy both tracked the movement, and when they registered Matteo, they went still in the same way. Not frightened. Assessing. 3 pairs of eyes, all the same unusual shade, that dark amber that Matteo had inherited from his grandmother and always assumed would die with him, because he'd never had children. The boy in the dark jacket stopped 3 feet away. He looked up at Matteo with an expression that was terrifyingly composed for a child his age. "Dad," he said, "not a question. Mom said you'd come back." The room kept going. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed at the far end. The string quartet in the corner moved into a new piece. Matteo heard none of it. His entire nervous system had compressed into this single moment and the word the boy had just used. "Dad, what's your name?" Matteo said. His voice came out level, controlled. 30 years of discipline keeping him from what he actually felt, which was the specific vertigo of a man who has just watched the ground shift 4 inches to the left with no warning. "Nico," the boy said. He pointed backward without looking. That's Lila. That's Theo. Lila, still arms crossed. Theo, still patient, now watching Matteo with those ancient, quiet eyes. Who is your mother? Matteo said. Nico blinked, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty moved across his face. Like he'd expected Matteo to already know. Like the question itself confused him. Elena, Nico said. Elena Marlowe. Matteo heard the name the way you hear something in a dream, with recognition that bypasses logic and goes straight to something older and more essential. His chest did something that had no clinical name. His jaw tightened. Where is she? He said, right now. Where is your mother? Nico looked over his shoulder. His finger went up. Matteo followed the direction. On the far side of the room, near the doors that opened onto the terrace, a woman in a deep green dress stood with her back partially to the room, speaking to someone. Her hair was different, shorter. She was thinner than he remembered, but her posture was exactly the same the set of her shoulders, the particular angle at which Elena Marlowe held her spine when she was in a room full of people she didn't entirely trust. 8 years. She looked like 8 years had built something into her, not taken anything away. Matteo moved. He crossed the room at a pace that was controlled but not slow, and he watched Elena's body language shift in the 2 seconds before she turned around. Something in the crowd's behavior changed when he moved through it. People noticed, stepped back slightly, the way they always had, and Elena, who had always been better at reading rooms than he gave her credit for, registered the change. She turned, she saw him coming, and whatever Matteo had expected, shock or guilt or fear, he did not see any of those things. What he saw was a woman who had known this moment was coming and had spent a significant amount of time preparing for it. Her expression was composed. Her chin was level. Her eyes met his without flinching. Matteo outside, he said. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she excused herself from the person she'd been speaking to, and she walked ahead of him to the terrace. The terrace was narrow and cold, exposed to the November wind off the lake. Neither of them acknowledged the temperature. Matteo pulled the glass door shut behind him. Below them, the city moved. Traffic. Light. The indifferent geometry of a place that didn't care about any of this. How old are they? He said. 8, Elena said. They turned 8 in February. He did the math. He had done it already, in the 30 seconds it took to cross the room, but he did it again now standing in front of her. February, 8 years old. The divorce had been finalized 9 years ago, which meant Elena had been pregnant when she signed those papers. You knew, he said. I found out 6 weeks later. And you said nothing. She looked at him steadily. No, I didn't. His jaw worked. Elena, you had already chosen Sabrina, she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice when she said it. That was the part that landed hardest, the complete absence of performance. She wasn't building toward anything. She wasn't punishing him. She was simply telling him the sequence of events. You had made your choice. I wasn't going to show up at your door pregnant, and they're my children. Yes, she said, they are. You didn't tell me I had 3 children. No, she said again. I didn't. He turned away from her, braced both hands on the railing and looked out over the water and breathed in a way that was slow and deliberate, because the alternative was not breathing at all. He had managed many crises in his life. He had sat across from men who wanted him dead and negotiated with complete calm. He had watched things he loved burn and kept his face still. He was not calm right now. He turned back. You raised them to come to this event, he said. You brought them here. Tonight. Something moved in Elena's expression. Barely. Nico found the invitation in my bag 3 weeks ago. He asked me what it was. I told him it was a charity event. She paused. He asked me if you would be there, Anne? I told him I didn't know. She held his gaze. He's been asking about you since he was 4, Matteo. All 3 of them have. I never told them you were a bad man. I never told them you abandoned them. I told them the truth that things between you and me didn't work, and that the world is complicated, and that her voice tightened slightly on the last part. That sometimes good people don't find each other at the right time. That's not the whole truth. No, she said. But it was the truth they needed at 4 years old. He looked at her for a long time. The wind moved her hair. She didn't push it back. Nico told me you said I'd come back, Matteo said quietly. Elena was quiet for a moment. I told him that if you ever saw him, she said carefully, you would know him. And that would change things. She looked away from Matteo, toward the glass doors, and the shapes of 3 children visible through them. Nico now apparently interrogating a passing server about something. I don't know if I was right to say that. I still don't know. Mateo followed her gaze to the children. He watched Nico. He watched Lila tug something out of Theo's hands and then give it back immediately when Theo's face did a specific thing. He watched Theo, whose patience was somehow already ageless, put whatever it was into his pocket and say something that made Nico laugh. 3 children he had never seen before this evening. 3 children who had his grandmother's eyes. 3 children who had been 8 years old for almost a year already, and who had first words and first steps and first days of school and fevers and scraped knees and nightmares that he had been entirely absent for, not because he was dead, not because he was unreachable, but because Elena had made a decision, and he had not known to fight it. I want to meet them, he said, properly. You already met Nico, Elena said. Nico introduced himself to you. That's very on brand for him. Mateo almost said something and then didn't. The other 2. Elena looked at him for another long moment, reading something, calculating something he couldn't quite follow. Then she pushed the door open and walked inside, and Mateo followed her. Theo was the one that undid him. Not immediately. The introductions were orderly. Elena brought the 3 of them over, with a composure that told Mateo she had rehearsed this moment, or something like it, more than once. Nico was direct and unimpressed, which Mateo recognized as a defense mechanism wearing the costume of confidence. Lila assessed him with those amber eyes for approximately 6 seconds, and then asked him, without preamble, whether he'd actually read the information on any of the auction items or just written his bid numbers down without looking, because she'd watched 3 adults do that tonight, and it seemed like a waste of money. He'd told her he hadn't bid on anything yet. She'd told him the wildlife sanctuary piece on table 4 was undervalued. He'd looked at her and felt something he didn't have a word for. But Theo was the one that sat down beside him, not next to Elena, not at the table with Nico and Lila. He climbed up onto the chair to Mateo's left without asking, arranged himself with the particular self-contained gravity of a child who is deeply comfortable in his own company, and opened a small book he'd apparently had in his jacket pocket the whole time. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, reading. Occasionally, without looking up, he would ask Mateo a question. Not big questions, small ones. Did Mateo know that the deepest part of Lake Michigan was 923 feet? Did Mateo know that the building they were in had been originally designed for something else? Did Mateo think it was strange that people built things for one purpose and then used them for something completely different? Mateo answered every question. By the 4th one, he understood that Theo wasn't making small talk. Theo was testing something, checking whether Mateo would dismiss him or condescend to him or do the thing that adults so often did to quiet children, which was stop paying attention the moment they stopped being entertaining. Mateo did not stop paying attention. After the 6th question, Theo looked up from his book. Just briefly. He looked at Mateo with those eyes, and then he looked back down, and he said, very quietly, Nico talks about you the most, but I've been thinking about you the longest. Mateo kept his face still. Is that right? He said. Yeah, Theo turned a page. I had a lot of questions. You can ask them, Mateo said. Theo considered this with apparent seriousness. Not tonight, he decided. There are too many people here. He glanced up one more time. Maybe later. Yeah, Mateo said, maybe later. Theo went back to his book. Mateo sat with the specific devastation of a man who has just understood something too late to undo it, and too clearly to pretend he hadn't. He found Elena near the bar an hour later. Not drinking. Standing near it, watching the room, doing the things she had always done at events like this, cataloging exits and people and the specific currents of tension that moved through rooms the way weather systems moved through open water. She had always been better at reading rooms than he'd admitted. He stood beside her. Theo told me he's been thinking about me the longest, Mateo said. Elena closed her eyes briefly, opened them. He didn't tell me he was going to say that. Does he say things like that often? Theo says whatever is true, she said. He just usually waits until he knows someone well enough to spend the truth on them. She paused. He apparently decided you qualified. Mateo's jaw tightened. Not from anger, from something else. I want to be in their lives. I know. I'm not asking your permission. Her expression shifted not to anger, but to something sharpened. Don't do that, she said quietly. Don't use that voice with me, Mateo. I'm not anyone you get to manage. I'm their mother. I made decisions that kept them safe, and I will continue making decisions that keep them safe. And if you want to be in their lives, you come in the right way, or you don't come in at all." He said nothing for a moment. "The right way," he said. "Their terms," she said, "and mine, not yours." He looked at her. The green dress, the shorter hair, the 8 additional years of something hard and careful built into the line of her mouth. He had known this woman once, or believed he had, and he understood now, standing beside her in a room full of people who would have deferred to him completely, that he had not known her at all. He had known the version of her that existed inside his world. He had not known what she became when she left it. "All right," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That's it? All right?" "I don't have a counter-argument," he said. "You're right." She studied him. "You've changed. I haven't changed enough," he said. And he meant it. Elena looked away from him. Across the room, Nico was now apparently arguing about something with Lila, and Theo was watching with that patient expression. And the three of them were entirely absorbed in being a family unit that had learned to function without Matteo Deverio in it, and that fact sat in his chest like a stone. "I need you to understand something," Elena said. She was still watching the children. "I didn't bring them here tonight to punish you. I didn't arrange this." Nico found the invitation. "I told myself I would let him decide." She paused. "He decided he's 8. He's your son," she said. "He decided in about 30 seconds. Matteo looked at Nico. Watched the boy's jaw set when Lila said something he disagreed with. Watched him argue his point with his whole body. And then, when Lila said something else, reconsider visibly and change his position without making a production of it. That, Matteo thought. That specific sequence, I do that. I have done that my entire life and never known where it came from. I'm going to do this correctly, Matteo said. "I hope so," Elena said. She finally looked at him. "But hope doesn't do the work." "You do." He did not sleep that night. He went home to the house he had rebuilt after the divorce, the house that was large and deliberately impersonal, filled with things his interior designer had chosen based on his budget and the absence of a woman's influence, and he sat in the dark in a room that had never once felt like too much space until right now. He knew what Elena had done and why she had done it. He had spent the drive home refusing to examine it too closely, because examining it clearly meant confronting the sequence of events that led here, and that sequence started with a divorce he had initiated, and a woman named Sabrina, and a decision he'd made when he was 41 years old, and certain with the particular arrogance of a man who has never been truly wrong about anything that he knew what he wanted. He'd been wrong. He'd been wrong in a way that had produced 3 children he hadn't known existed, raised by a woman who had apparently decided the only way to protect them from his world was to disappear from it entirely, and who had done exactly that, with a thoroughness and a discipline that he should have recognized as entirely consistent with everything he'd known about Elena Marlowe. She had always been thorough. He'd mistaken it for passivity. He picked up his phone at 2 in the morning. He did not call Elena. He didn't have her number, hadn't gotten it, hadn't thought to get it in the vertigo of the evening. He sat with the phone in his hand and thought about Theo, asking whether it was strange to build things for one purpose and use them for something else. He thought about Lila and the auction table and the wildlife sanctuary piece. He thought about Nico, who had walked across a ballroom floor at 8 years old and introduced himself to a man he had never met by calling him Dad. He set the phone down. He sat in the dark until the city outside his windows changed color, and then he got up and made coffee he didn't drink, and stood at the window and looked out at Chicago and thought about all the things he had built and broken and called success. His attorney reached him at 7:30 in the morning. Not about the children. His attorney didn't know about the children yet. About Sabrina. Specifically about the interview Sabrina Vale had given to a magazine feature published online at midnight, in which she discussed her relationship with Matteo Deverio, with enough strategic ambiguity to imply far more than she stated, and plant exactly the seeds she intended to plant. She had not mentioned Elena by name. She had mentioned in passing, with practiced sorrow, that she sometimes felt Matteo struggled to fully commit because of the past, because of unresolved things, without saying that there was a woman, a complication. Matteo read the article twice in the time it took to drink the coffee he'd finally made himself drink. Sabrina had known about the charity event. He had told her he was attending, had not told her why, had not mentioned Elena was connected to it. But Sabrina had her own sources. She always had. It was one of the things he'd found useful about her, early on, and one of the things he had stopped finding useful roughly 14 months into their relationship, when he realized that information moved towards Sabrina and rarely moved back out in the same form. She had felt him pulling away, not last night, before last night. She'd felt it for months, the gradual reorientation of his attention toward the parts of his life that didn't include her, and she'd been working on a response. The article was the opening move. Matteo forwarded the link to his attorney with one instruction: find out who pitched the feature and when. Then he put the phone down and called his contact, the one person in his organization who kept information about things that happened in Chicago at the level where charities were organized an invitation. Lists were compiled and asked a single question. How had Elena Marlowe ended up on the guest list for last night's event? The answer came back in 40 minutes. Elena had not been on the original list. She'd been added 3 weeks ago, at the personal request of the event's co-chair. The event's co-chair was a woman named Diane Costello. Matteo knew that name. Diane Costello's husband, Vincent, had been a mid-level figure in the DeVario organization for 11 years. He had been loyal, competent, and almost entirely invisible, which in Matteo's world was a form of excellence. Had been. Vincent Costello had left the organization 8 months ago. Quietly, at his own request. Matteo had allowed it because there was no reason not to. He sat with this information for a long moment. Then he opened his laptop and looked at 3 things in sequence: Vincent Costello's current employment, the financial records attached to the charity event, and the donor list for the past 3 iterations of the organization Elena had once run. By the time he closed the laptop, he understood that last night had not been coincidence. Someone had arranged for Elena and the children to be in that room. The question was whether it was Diane Costello acting on sentiment or Vincent Costello acting on something else. And behind that question, smaller and quieter but refusing to stay quiet, who else knew about the children? He met with Elena 3 days later. Not at her restaurant, not at her home. She hadn't offered her home, and he hadn't asked. They met at a coffee place near the northern edge of Lincoln Park, the kind of place that was full at 10 in the morning with people doing the thing where they worked on laptops in public because they needed the ambient noise of other humans. Matteo arrived first. She arrived precisely on time in jeans and a jacket, looking nothing like the woman in the green dress and exactly like the woman who used to argue with him across their kitchen at 7 in the morning about things that now seemed completely weightless. She sat down across from him. He slid a card across the table. His attorney's contact information. For arranging access. Formally. Whatever you need, shared schedule, visitation structure, whatever you want to call it. She looked at the card but didn't pick it up. You're moving quickly. I've already missed 8 years, he said. I don't feel like moving slowly. That's about you, she said. Not about them. He held her gaze. I know that, do you? I'm trying to, he said. Which was the honest answer. And he could tell from the way something in her expression adjusted slightly that she recognized honesty in his voice the same way she always had, not because he was often dishonest, but because he was often precise, and honesty and precision were not always the same thing. She picked up the card. Nico wants to see you again, she said. He asked me 4 times in 2 days, and the others? Leela is thinking about it. She's cautious about new things. A brief pause. She's cautious about people she can't read yet. And Theo? Elena looked at her coffee. Theo hasn't said anything. Which means he's processing, she said. He processes quietly and then he comes out the other side, having already made a decision. You just don't know what the decision is until he tells you, Slepsiu. Matteo looked at his own coffee. He told me he'd been thinking about me the longest. I know. He told me too, her voice was careful. He also told me he wasn't sure whether you were worth the thinking. Matteo absorbed that, and he said he hadn't decided yet. She looked up. He's 8, Matteo. He has 8 years of questions and no reason yet to believe the answers are going to be worth anything. I'm going to give him answers. Give him time first, she said. Answers without time are just words. He looked at her. The woman who had packed up 3 infants and rebuilt a life without using his name or his money or his protection, in a city that knew his name the way other cities knew weather. He had no idea where she'd gone. He had no idea how she'd managed it. He had not looked, he had believed the divorce was over and complete and sealed, the way everything in his life was either controlled or concluded, and Elena had used that certainty against him without ever appearing to use anything at all. "Where have you been living?" he said. "Milwaukee mostly." "Portland for 2 years. We came back to Chicago 8 months ago." 8 months. She'd been back in Chicago for 8 months. He had not known. "The children's school is not something I'm sharing yet," she said without heat. "When there's a formal structure in place, and I know you're not going to send, I'm not being difficult. I'm being careful." She looked at him directly. "Your world is not safe, Matteo." "It never was. I left because of that, not only because of Sabrina." He said nothing. "I need to know," she said quietly, "that bringing you back into their lives doesn't bring everything else back with it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm working on that," he said. It wasn't enough. He could see that clearly. But it was what was true, and Elena had always been able to distinguish between what was true and what was performative, which was one of the reasons he had once trusted her completely, and then, in the slow distraction of building an empire, and drifting toward a woman who reflected that empire back to him more flatteringly, forgotten that her trust was worth more than any room he had ever controlled. She nodded once, not in forgiveness, in acknowledgement. "Saturday," she said. 2 hours. Neutral location. "I'll bring all 3. I'll be there," he said. He watched her leave. She threaded through the crowded coffee shop without looking back, and Matteo sat with his hands around a cup that had gone cold and thought about 8 years, and 3 children, and all the first times he would never get back. Then he thought about Vincent Costello and the invitation list, and the fact that someone had arranged this reunion for reasons he had not yet fully understood. And underneath all of it, quieter than the rest, the way Theo had sat beside him without being asked and read his book and trusted him with 7 small questions before deciding tonight was enough. He was going to find out who had put Elena in that room. And he was going to make sure, whatever came next, that the 3 people with his grandmother's eyes never had reason to be afraid of the answer. Saturday came in cold and flat, the kind of November morning that didn't bother pretending to be anything other than what it was. Matteo arrived at the park 20 minutes early, not because he was anxious. He told himself that clearly, standing beside the car, while Marco, his driver, his shadow for 11 years, waited without comment. He arrived early because he was always early, because in his world, the man who arrived first controlled the terms of the space. Except this wasn't his world. This was a public park in Lincoln Park, with a climbing structure and 2 benches and a hot dog cart that wasn't open yet, and Elena was going to arrive with his 3 children, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with any of that. He put his hands in his coat pockets and stood near the bench, farthest from the entrance, and waited. They arrived at exactly 2 o'clock. He heard them before he saw them. Nico's voice first, mid-sentence, already arguing something, and then Elena's voice, lower, not correcting him exactly, but redirecting him the way you redirect moving water. Then the entrance gate opened and all 4 of them came through, and Matteo felt his chest do the thing it had been doing since Thursday, which was tighten without warning, and then refuse to loosen all the way. Nico saw him immediately. His stride changed, not running, but faster, with the barely contained energy of a kid who had decided something and was executing the decision before he could second-guess it. He stopped 3 feet away, which was apparently his preferred conversational distance, and looked Matteo up and down. "You're wearing a coat," Nico said. "It's November," Matteo said. "Yeah, but it's a formal coat. This is how I dress." Nico considered this. "You could have worn something normal." "I don't own a lot of normal," Matteo said. Nico processed that. Apparently decided it was acceptable. "Okay." Lila approached more slowly, with Elena's hand loosely in hers, not held the way a frightened child holds a parent's hand, more like contact maintained out of habit. She was watching Matteo with the particular focused attention of someone taking inventory. She had a small notebook under her other arm. He did not ask about it. "Hi," she said. "Hi, Lila, you remembered which one I am." "You're not easy to mix up," he said. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. She released Elena's hand and moved to the bench and sat down, opened the notebook, and began writing something. Not ignoring him, observing him from a slight remove, which was a thing Matteo understood because he had done it his entire adult life. Theo was last. He came through the gate at Elena's pace, walking beside her rather than ahead, And when he reached Mateo, he stopped and looked up with those steady eyes and said, "I thought about the questions." "Did you decide?" Mateo said. "Some of them," Theo said. "Not all of them. Ask the ones you decided on." Theo looked at the bench, then at the climbing structure, then back at Mateo. "Can we walk?" They walked. Elena stayed on the bench with Lila, close enough to see everything, far enough to give the boys space that wasn't performed. Mateo walked with Nico on his left, and Theo on his right along the path that curved around the edge of the park, and Nico talked about school, about something that had happened with a teacher that month, about a book he'd started and abandoned because it was too slow, about whether Mateo had ever been in a fight, which transitioned immediately into whether Mateo had ever won a fight, which Mateo answered honestly and briefly, and Nico took that answer and turned it over and then moved on to the next thing. Theo asked 2 questions. The first was, "Did you know Mom was going to have us?" Mateo stopped walking. Nico went a few steps further before he noticed and stopped too. Mateo crouched down to Theo's level, not because children required crouching, but because the question required it. He looked at Theo directly. "No," he said, "I didn't know." Theo held his gaze. "Would you have stayed?" The honest answer was complicated. The complicated answer was not what an 8-year-old needed. But Theo's eyes were doing that thing where they measured the distance between what was being said and what was being meant, and Mateo understood, looking at him, that this child would know immediately if the answer was curated. "I don't know," Mateo said. "I want to tell you yes. But the man I was 8 years ago made bad decisions. I can't promise that man would have made the right one." Theo was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay." "That's an honest answer," Theo said. "Nico said you'd probably say yes automatically. I told him you probably wouldn't." Mateo looked at Nico, who shrugged with the particular unapologetic energy of someone whose prediction had simply not panned out. "What was the second question?" Mateo said to Theo. Theo started walking again. Mateo stood and followed. "I'll save it," Theo said, "for later." The 2 hours passed in the specific way that meaningful time passes too fast in the middle and slow at the edges, with a quality of detail that ordinary time doesn't produce. Mateo pushed Theo on the swing when Theo asked, which surprised him. He hadn't expected Theo to want that, had placed him as the type who observed rather than participated. But Theo wanted to be pushed, and he wanted to go high, and he sat with his book in his lap on the upswing and read 2 sentences before it came back down, which made Nico declare it the stupidest thing he'd ever seen and then immediately ask for a turn. Lila came off the bench eventually. She showed Mateo the notebook. Not offered showed, which was a different thing. She held it open to a page covered in small, dense handwriting, column formations, numbers in the margins. "What is this?" he said. "I've been tracking things," she said. "What kind of things?" "Patterns," she said. "When Nico gets frustrated, what he does. When Theo goes quiet, what it means. Mom's schedule, what changes when she's worried versus when she's just tired." She turned a page. "I started a new section." He looked at the new section. At the top, in Lila's handwriting, was a single word. Mateo. Below it, 3 entries from the charity event. Observations. Brief, precise, entirely accurate. He looked at his daughter. "You've been tracking me since Thursday," he said. "Since the event," she corrected. "You tilted your head when Theo asked about the lake. You touched your left coat pocket 3 times when Mom was talking to you on the terrace. When Nico said something that surprised you, your jaw went like..." She demonstrated a slight tightening, barely perceptible. That means you're controlling something." Mateo looked at her for a long moment. "Your mother teach you that?" he said. "No," Lila said. "I figured it out myself." He believed her. Elena came over in the last 20 minutes. She sat on the bench beside Mateo and watched the 2 boys argue about the proper technique for climbing the outer edge of the structure, and Lila sat on Mateo's other side still making notes, and for a stretch of approximately 7 minutes, none of the adults spoke. It was not comfortable, but it was real. When 2 o'clock became 4, a stood and gathered the children, with that particular gravitational authority mothers develop, and there were coats and bags, and Nico's complaint about the timing, which Elena redirected without raising her voice, and Theo, who had already zipped his jacket and was waiting by the gate, with the patience of someone who had accepted the timeline. Lila paused beside Mateo before following her mother. "You passed," she said. "Passed what?" he said. "The first test," she said. She didn't explain further. She tucked the notebook under her arm and followed Elena through the gate. Matteo stood at the bench and watched them go. Marco said nothing. He had said nothing all afternoon, which was why Matteo had kept him for 11 years. Same time next week? Marco said finally when Matteo reached the car. Matteo got in. Yeah, he said. The call from his attorney came Monday morning at 6:45, and it did not start well and declined from there. Vincent Costello had not added Elena to the guest list out of sentiment. He had done it because he was currently in a conversation. The word his attorney used was conversation, which in this context meant something with defined sides and active participants with a man named Gerald Pruitt. Gerald Pruitt was not a name Matteo knew, which was itself a problem, because Matteo knew most of the names that mattered in Chicago, and a name he didn't know operating in his adjacent territory was a name that had been kept from him deliberately. Gerald Pruitt was the business manager of Sabrina Vale. Matteo's attorney read that sentence from his notes and then paused the way professionals pause when they're letting information detonate at its own pace. Matteo was quiet for 4 seconds. When did Costello start talking to Pruitt? He said. We think 6 months ago. Maybe longer. What does Pruitt want? That's the part I'm still working on, his attorneys, he said. What I know is that Pruitt has been running financial instruments through 3 shell accounts that connect, at a distance, to 2 of your legitimate holdings. Not enough to constitute anything actionable. Enough to create a pattern if someone decided to present it that way. Matteo understood immediately. He's building a frame. That's what it looks like. For what purpose? The most charitable interpretation, his attorney said, is that Sabrina wants leverage. Something to use if the relationship ends badly. And the less charitable interpretation. A pause. That someone above Pruitt has a longer game in mind and Sabrina is just the access point. Matteo ended the call. He stood at his kitchen window with his phone in his hand and looked at the city the way he'd looked at it 3 days ago when it didn't care about any of this, and it still didn't care, and the indifference of it was clarifying. 6 months ago, Pruitt had started building something. 6 months ago, Matteo had also started quietly, with no announcements, with the specific deliberateness of a man who doesn't move until he knows where he's going, repositioning certain assets in his organization. Stepping back from 3 operations he'd decided were no longer worth the risk. Beginning to wall off the legitimate businesses from the parts of the Deverio organization that operated in the space between what was legal and what was not. Someone had noticed, and they had decided to move while he was in transition. He called Carmine Russo. Carmine picked up on the second ring, because Carmine always picked up on the second ring when Matteo called, which was one of the reasons Carmine had been his most trusted lieutenant for 14 years. I need to know everything you have on Gerald Pruitt, Matteo said. A beat, Pruitt, Sabrina's manager. Yeah, another beat, this one different. Thinking, I've heard the name in passing. Nothing that flagged. It should have flagged, Matteo said. There's no heat in it. Just the fact of it. I'll have something for you by tonight, Carmen said. By noon, Matteo said. He hung up. He stood at the window for another minute, running the sequence. Pruitt connected to Costello. Costello's wife puts Elena in that room. Elena appears at the event with 3 children who are visibly, unmistakably Matteo's. Someone at the event would have noticed several someones, the particular kind who paid attention and moved information. By Sunday, it would have been in circulation. By Monday, Pruitt would know about the children. If he didn't know already, Matteo went still. Pruitt had put Elena in that room. Not Diane Costello acting on sentiment. Pruitt, through Costello's wife, had arranged for Elena and 3 children with Matteo's face to appear at a public event attended by a significant portion of Chicago's networked social infrastructure. Not as a coincidence, as a reveal. Because a man with 3 secret children was a man with a vulnerability that hadn't existed yesterday. Matteo put on his coat and went to find Carmine. They met at the office, not the public one, the one 3 floors below the public one that had no signage and a door that looked like a wall. And Carmine was already there when Matteo arrived, which meant Carmine had also been thinking. Talk, Matteo said. Carmine's hands were flat on the table. He was a big man, Carmine-wide shoulders, broken nose from a fight he'd had at 22 and never had fixed because he felt the asymmetry made him more honest-looking, which it did not. He had been with Matteo since before the organization was what it currently was, and he knew where every decision had come from and what it had cost. Pruitt, Carmine said, is a talent manager the way I'm a tour guide. His public business is legitimate. His other income comes from brokering information. Personal information, professional, financial, anything with value to the right buyer. He paused. He has been connected at various removes to two separate federal investigations. Both times he was not charged. Both times the investigation ended because key witnesses renegotiated their arrangements. He facilitates, Mateo said. He facilitates, Carmine confirmed. Whatever someone with power wants to make happen or make disappear, Pruitt moves the pieces. He's working for someone, Mateo said. Sabrina is the access. She's not the client. Carmine nodded slowly. That's my read. Who? I don't know yet. Mateo's jaw tightened. Who inside this organization knew about the repositioning? Carmine looked at him directly. Me, your attorney. The three people handling the asset transfers. A pause. And Danny Reese. Danny Reese was 29 years old, a second-generation DeVario man who had moved up fast and efficiently, and whom Mateo had placed 8 months ago in a position adjacent to the repositioning work because he needed someone with clean hands and clear accounting skills. Reese, Mateo said. I'm not saying Reese, Carmine said quickly. You just said Reese. I said his name as part of a list, Carmine said. I'm not accusing him of anything. I'm saying those are the people who knew. Mateo looked at the wall for a moment. Get me Reese's financials for the last 18 months, he said. His personal accounts, not his salary deposits. I want to see what moves. Carmine absorbed this. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything, Mateo said. That's the problem. Carmine nodded and reached for his phone. Mateo stood and went to the window. There was no view from this window. Just a shaft of gray light from an air shaft between buildings, and thought about Elena and 3 children and a park bench on a Saturday and the specific terrible clarity of understanding that someone had planned to use all of it. Someone had looked at the children and seen leverage. Not 3 kids with his grandmother's eyes. Not Nico with his chin-set stubbornness. Not Theo with his questions and his book. Not Lila with her notebook and her one-word categories. Just leverage. Mateo turned around. No one touches Pruitt yet, he said. I want him walking around thinking he's 3 steps ahead. I want him comfortable. Carmine nodded. And the children, Mateo said. I need a security detail on Elena that she doesn't know about. Carmine looked at him. She'll find out. Eventually, Mateo said. Find out and be angry about it later. What I can't have is earlier. He called Elena that evening. She had given him her number, eventually after the park a practical concession, structured around the children's schedule. He had not used it until now. She picked up on the 4th ring. He heard the ambient noise of a kitchen, something simmering, one of the boys in the background. Mateo, she said, I need to tell you something, he said. A short pause. The background noise diminished. She'd moved to another room. Okay, there are people in my world who know about the children now. He kept his voice even. I don't believe there's an immediate threat, but I want a security presence around you. Around all of you. Not visible, not intrusive. Elena, listen to me? No, she said. This is not me controlling the situation. This is me. I said no, she said, and her voice had gone to a particular register he remembered, the one that was not loud but was also not moving. I left your world specifically so my children would not need security details and threat assessments and… I know, he said. Then why are we having this conversation? Because someone put you in that room on Saturday deliberately, he said. It wasn't Diane Costello acting on goodwill. It was arranged. By a man who is connected to people who want to use the children's existence to minus… Stop. Her voice was different now. Still controlled, but the control was costing something. He could hear it. You're telling me that someone already knows. Yes. The silence on the other end was 3 seconds long. How long, she said. I don't know. Since the event at minimum. Possibly before. Another silence. He heard her exhale. One controlled breath. The kind you take when you want to say something, and you're deciding whether to say it. I came back to Chicago 8 months ago, she said. I came back because the school here was better and because Theo's specialist was here and because I was tired of running. Her voice was very quiet. I told myself we'd been gone long enough, that the risk had faded. Elena, I want to know, she said, whether you believe my children are in danger. Not danger in the abstract, real specific danger. Yes or no, he was honest. Not yet, he said, but if I don't act now, yes. Another breath. This one not controlled. 2 weeks, she said. You have 2 weeks to resolve whatever this is. If in 2 weeks this conversation hasn't changed, I'm gone again. I will move the children somewhere you don't know about, and I will not tell you where. That is not a negotiation, she said. That is what happens. Are we clear? He closed his eyes briefly. We're clear, he said. She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand and thought about 2 weeks and what it would take and whether he had enough left of the man he'd been to move fast enough and enough of the man he was trying to become to do it the right way. Both at once was not a skill he had ever developed. The financial records on Danny Reese came back Wednesday morning. Mateo went through them alone, which was not how he usually did things. Usually he had Carmine or his attorney reading alongside him, checking his read, balancing his instincts against their caution. But this one, he needed to see himself first. He went through 18 months of Reese's personal accounts in 40 minutes. Nothing obvious. Reese lived within his means, which were generous but not outlandish. Regular deposits, predictable spending, nothing that screamed external income. Then Mateo looked at the timing, not the amounts. The timing. Reese's spending patterns had shifted 8.5 months ago. Not dramatically. He hadn't bought a car or a property. But the pattern of where money moved, the frequency, the account distribution, had the specific rhythm of someone who was being paid in a way they'd been advised to make invisible. Not screaming, whispering. Mateo closed the file. He sat with the knowledge that one of 5 people who knew about his repositioning had been compromised, and that the compromised person had been placed adjacent to that information by Mateo himself and Cortin, and that this was therefore not a failure of Reese's loyalty, but a failure of his own judgment. He had put Reese there. He had trusted his read of the young man. He had been wrong. Carmine was going to say, "I'm not saying Reese again," and Mateo was going to explain to him that the records didn't say Reese either. Not definitively, but the timing did. In the absence of a more likely answer, timing was what you worked with. He called Carmine. "It's Reese," he said. Silence. "You're certain?" Carmine said. "Certain enough," Mateo said. "I want him watched, not approached. I want to know every call he makes, every meeting. I want to know who he talks to and what about. Can you do that without him knowing?" "Yes," Carmine said, flat and final. "Don't approach him," Mateo said again. "I want to see where he goes first." "Understood." He hung up. He stood up from the desk and walked to the small window again, and pressed his thumb against the cold glass and thought about the park on Saturday and Theo on the swing reading 2 sentences on the upswing and Lila's notebook, and Nico's declaration that the coat was too formal. Someone had looked at those 3 children and decided they were useful. He was going to find out exactly who, and he was going to make sure that when he did, what remained of the structure that had made those children a target would not survive the finding. He saw the children again Thursday. Elena had allowed it a brief informal visit after school, 2 hours at her apartment building's common room, rather than her actual apartment, which was a boundary he respected because it was a reasonable one, and because Elena's boundaries had always been reasonable, even when he hadn't treated them that way. Nico arrived with a bruise on his jaw, not a fall. Mateo could see immediately it wasn't a fall. The angle was wrong. The distribution of the coloring was the specific geometry of something that had made direct horizontal contact. He didn't ask in front of the other 2. He waited until Theo had found a table and opened the book he'd brought, and Lila had settled beside Theo and opened her notebook, and Nico was standing near the window, not looking at him. "Nico," Mateo said quietly. The boy turned. He had that chin-set look, the one that was about not showing that something mattered. "What happened?" Mateo said. "Nothing. I see the bruise." "It's fine." "I'm not saying it's not fine," Mateo said. "I'm asking what happened." Nico was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked slightly the same movement Lila had catalogued, the one Mateo recognized from mirrors. "Kid at school," he said. He said something. "About what?" Another silence, longer. "About you," Nico said. "He said his dad told him that your name meant you were—" He stopped. Started again. "He said something about what our last name is and what it means that we don't have the same last name as you. He said my mom—" His voice went tight. "He said my mom hit us because she was ashamed of you." Mateo held himself very still. "And you hit him," Mateo said. Nico's chin went up a fraction. "He said something about mom." "Yeah," Mateo said. "I heard that part." He looked at his son, a word that still arrived with a weight he hadn't learned to carry normally, and understood that the information about the children was already moving. It had already reached the school, which meant it had already reached the social infrastructure around the school. which meant Elena's 2-week window was optimistic. He kept his face level for Nico's benefit. Did he start it, Matteo said. Nico met his eyes. Yeah, okay, Matteo said. We're still going to talk about whether hitting is the right response. But not tonight. Nico blinked. He'd apparently expected something else, anger, or dismissal, or a lecture. Okay, he said. You say anything else about me? The kid's dad? Nico hesitated. That hesitation was its own answer. Tell me, Matteo said. Quiet, no pressure in it. Nico looked at the floor. He said you were done, that someone had figured out how to finish you, and it was only a matter of time. He looked up. His eyes were doing something they hadn't done at the park or the charity event, something younger and more frightened than his face wanted to show. Is that true? Matteo held his son's gaze.
No, he said.
That's not true. Nico held the eye contact for a long moment, measuring. Then he nodded once, with the abrupt finality of someone filing a decision, and went to sit beside Theo. Matteo straightened. He looked at his 3 children arranged around that table, Nico's bruised jaw, Lila's pen moving, Theo's eyes traveling across a page, and the cold, clarifying anger that moved through him was not the anger of a man threatened in his empire. It was the anger of a father who had just heard his son report a threat in a schoolyard from a child repeating an adult's words. Someone was using the children as a message delivery system. And they'd done it, knowing that a bruised 8-year-old in that chair was the kind of thing that either broke a man or rebuilt him into something considerably more dangerous. He pulled out his phone and sent Carmine a single message. Accelerate the Reese timeline. I want answers by Friday. Then he put his phone away and went and sat at the table with his children and asked Theo what the book was about. And Theo told him, and the explanation was so detailed and so good that even Nico forgot about his jaw for a while and started listening. Outside, somewhere in the city, someone was counting on Matteo Daverio to react the way he always had, with force and noise and the full, terrible weight of his organization. They were about to learn that the man who showed up for 3 children on a Thursday afternoon was a different calculation entirely. Lila looked up from her notebook at one point and found Matteo watching the door. She followed his gaze, found nothing unusual. She looked back at him. She wrote something in the notebook. He didn't ask what. But when she tilted it slightly, the way she sometimes did when she was deciding whether to share, when she tilted it and he caught the word she'd written under the new section with his name at the top, what he saw was a single entry. Scared, but not for himself. His daughter had written that about him at age 8, and she was not wrong. Friday morning arrived gray and indistinct, and with it came Carmine's report on Danny Reese. Reese had made 4 calls in the past 48 hours to a number registered to a communications front in the financial district. 3 of the calls lasted under a minute. The 4th lasted 19 minutes, and it had been made on Wednesday evening, 2 hours after Matteo had told Carmine to accelerate the timeline. Which meant Reese had known that the acceleration was coming. Which meant Reese had a source inside Matteo's own inner circle close enough to know what Matteo had said to Carmine. Matteo read the report. He read it twice. Then he called his attorney and said 4 words, "Pull the Reese file." His attorney said, "All of it?" "All of it," Matteo said. "And find out who owns the communications front. Go back as far as you need to." By noon, the communications front traced back through 2 holding structures to a man named Alan Forsyth. Alan Forsyth. Matteo sat with the name for exactly 7 seconds before the recognition arrived, and when it did, it was not like a revelation. It was like the specific cold clarity of something you should have seen coming and didn't. Alan Forsyth had worked for the Daverio organization for 8 years. He had left 3 years ago under unremarkable circumstances, a disagreement about compensation, a negotiated exit, no open conflict. Matteo had not considered him an enemy because Alan Forsyth at his exit had not had the profile of a man with long-game ambitions. But 3 years was a long time, and Alan Forsyth now, apparently, had Gerald Pruitt and Danny Reese in the social infrastructure of Sabrina Vale and a frame being quietly constructed around Matteo's repositioned assets. This was not opportunism. This had been planned before Matteo started repositioning, before the charity event, before Elena came back to Chicago. Forsyth had known Matteo would eventually try to get out, and he had built the mechanism to make sure that when Matteo tried, he would have no clean ground left to step onto. Matteo called Carmine. He did not speak immediately. Carmine, who had been with him long enough to understand what different kinds of silence meant, said, "How bad?" "Forsyth," Matteo said. The silence on Carmine's end was the answer. "You knew," Matteo said. "I had a suspicion," Carmine said. 6 weeks ago. I didn't have enough to bring you." "You had 6 weeks," Matteo said. "I know. And you waited." "I was making sure," Carmine said. "I didn't want to bring you wrong information about—" "You waited 6 weeks," Matteo said again, very quietly, "while someone was building a case around my assets, my children's existence, and my ability to move freely in this city. And you didn't bring it to me." The silence stretched. "I need you to think carefully," Matteo said, "about whether you made that decision alone." Carmine's breath came through the phone, controlled. The breath of a man who understood what was being asked under the question. "Yes," Carmine said. "I made it alone." Matteo listened to the weight of that yes. Listened to what it carried and what it didn't carry. The particular texture of a statement made by a man who was telling the truth about the specific thing being asked while the area around it remained very carefully unaddressed. "Come in," Matteo said. "Tonight, we're going to sit down and you're going to tell me everything you know about Forsyth. Everything. From the beginning." "Yes," Carmine said. "And Carmine," Matteo said. He paused. "Think carefully before tonight about whether there's anything else I should know. Because after tonight, I stop asking." He ended the call. He stood in the room that had no view and pressed the phone against his palm and understood, for the first time since the charity event, that the enemy was not outside his organization. It had never been outside his organization. And the man he had trusted for 14 years had known it for 6 weeks and said nothing. The question was whether Carmine had said nothing out of excessive caution, or whether Carmine's caution served someone other than Matteo. He didn't know the answer yet. But by tonight, one way or another, he would. And somewhere across the city, Elena had 2 weeks on a clock that was already running short, and 3 children who were already being used as words in a language. Matteo was only now beginning to fully read, and the man who had written that language had spent 3 years building toward a moment when Matteo Deverio would be standing. Exactly where he was standing right now, with nowhere clean left to step, and the thing he most needed to protect directly in the line of everything he'd spent his life becoming. Carmine arrived at 8, not to the office 3 floors below the public one. Matteo had changed the location twice, the second time less than an hour before the meeting, a precaution that was either excessive or exactly right, depending on what Carmine said in the next 2 hours. He had chosen a place on the west side, a building he owned through 4 removes, used for storage of legitimate inventory, never for meetings. Carmine would know it was unusual. That was the point. Matteo was already inside when Carmine came through the door. He did not offer a seat. Carmine read the room in approximately 2 seconds, stayed near the door with his hands visible and his face doing the thing it did when he was calibrating, reading the temperature, deciding how to enter a space that had already been configured against him. "Sit down," Matteo said. Carmine sat. Matteo looked at him across the table. 1 lamp, concrete floor. The smell of cold air and cardboard and machine oil. No theater in any of it, just the reduction of a situation to its necessary elements. "Tell me about Forsyth," Matteo said. Carmine put his hands flat on the table. 6 weeks ago, I picked up a secondary contact through one of our distribution channels. Someone feeding information laterally, not to a federal source, not to a competitor in the traditional sense. Moving it to a private receiver. It took me 3 weeks to trace the channel back to a structure Forsyth controls. 3 weeks, Matteo said. "Yes, and then another 3 weeks before you told me." Carmine's jaw moved. "I wanted to confirm the scope. I didn't want to bring you a half picture and watch you move on incomplete mites." "The scope," Matteo said. "Tell me the scope." Carmine exhaled through his nose. "Forsyth has been acquiring a position, not against the organization, directly against the transition. He knows you've been repositioning assets. He's been building documentation that makes the repositioning look like concealment. Financial instruments that, presented correctly, suggest the legitimate holdings are being used to launder the transition rather than replace what came before. He's going to take it to federal," Matteo said. "Not exactly." Carmine's eyes held his steadily. "He's going to sell it. To whoever makes the best offer. Federal is one option. A domestic competitor is another. An international buyer who wants your logistics infrastructure without paying for it is a third." Matteo said nothing. "The children," Carmine continued, "are the mechanism. Once it became known you had 3 unacknowledged heirs, Forsyth had something he hadn't had before. Leverage on your behavior. You move against him. He surfaces the documentation. And the children's existence simultaneously, the narrative writes itself. Mafia boss hides children, launders assets, retaliates against whistleblower. He paused. Clean hands he doesn't have, but perception is enough. How much does he have? Mateo said. The documentation. Enough, Carmine said. Not everything, but enough to make the wrong 3 people ask the wrong questions at the wrong time. Mateo stood up from the table. He walked to the far wall and back. Not pacing thinking, physically, the way he sometimes needed to when the information was complex enough that stillness wasn't processing it fast enough. He stopped. Reese, he said. Carmine nodded. Reese was feeding Forsyth confirmation on the repositioning timeline. When assets moved, what covered them, what the structure looked like from inside. And Pruitt, Mateo said. Pruitt's connection to Forsyth. Pruitt is Forsyth's external interface, Carmine said. Sabrina is the public access she gave Forsyth a reason to be adjacent to your life without it looking like surveillance. The magazine piece was Pruitt's first visible move. It was also a signal to Forsyth that the reveal was in motion. Mateo absorbed all of this in silence. Then he looked at Carmine. You said you traced the channel 6 weeks ago, Mateo said. You said it took 3 weeks to trace it to Forsyth. Yes, and in those 3 weeks, Mateo said, did the channel carry anything outward? Not just to Forsyth. Anything. Carmine's hands, still flat on the table, pressed slightly harder against the surface. Yes, he said. What? A pause. The particular pause of a man who has been carrying something and is deciding whether the moment to put it down has arrived or whether holding it longer is still possible. The children, Carmine said. 3 weeks before the charity event. The channel carried confirmation of Elena's location. Her return to Chicago. The school, the address. Mateo went completely still. Before the event, he said. Yes, Forsyth knew before the event. Yes. The quality of the silence in the room changed. It became something with weight and temperature. Mateo stood on his side of it and looked at Carmine and understood, in the specific way he understood things when they were irreversible, that the event had not been the beginning. The event had been the demonstration, a public reveal staged for an audience, after Forsyth already had everything he needed in private. He knew where my children went to school, Mateo said. Yes, for 3 weeks before I knew they existed. Carmine said nothing, which was its own answer. Mateo walked back to the table. He did not sit. He stood at the edge of it and looked at Carmine with the kind of attention that had ended careers and renegotiated realities for 30 years, and he let it sit there between them without saying anything, because the question he needed to ask next required Carmine to already understand what was being asked. The channel, Mateo said, the one you traced to Forsyth. Carmine met his eyes. Who was running it? Mateo said. The silence was 6 seconds. I need you to understand. Carmine said that what I did because I believed. Who was running it? Mateo said again. Carmine looked at the table. Me, says, for the first 4 weeks, before I understood what Forsyth was building. I was using it as a surveillance channel. I was monitoring what was going out, trying to identify the source. And in the process, he stopped, started again. In the process, I fed information that I believed was controlled, that I believed would let me trace the network without alerting anyone. But Mateo said, but Forsyth was running a countertap, Carmine said. Whatever I fed in, he extracted and used. I didn't know until the 4th week. By then, the children's location had already moved through. Mateo sat down. He sat very slowly, the way a large structure settles when something foundational has shifted, and he put both hands on the table and looked at them, and breathed in and out with the specific deliberateness of a man choosing not to respond from the part of himself that was loudest right now. You ran a channel, Mateo said, that fed my children's school and addressed to a man who has been building a case against me for 3 years. And you knew this for 6 weeks, and you said nothing. I was trying to fix it, Carmine said. His voice was tight. Not from deception, from the specific anguish of a man who has made a catastrophic error while trying to do the right thing. Mateo could hear the difference. He had heard a lot of lies in his life, and he could hear that this was not one. I thought I could contain it before it became. Before it became what? Mateo said. Before 3 children had an attempted abduction? Before a kid in a schoolyard repeated a threat to my son's face? Before... He stopped. He pressed his knuckles against the table. There was an attempt, Mateo said, slowly. He was reconstructing something. A timeline snapping into place, Nico's bruise. He said a kid's father told the kid you were done. That someone had figured out how to finish you, and it was only a matter of time. He looked at Carmine. That wasn't a schoolyard rumor. That was a message. Delivered through a child to a child, which means Forsyth already has people adjacent to the school. Carmine said nothing. How adjacent, Mateo said. I don't know, Carmine said. I've been trying to map my... How adjacent, Carmine? Carmine's jaw worked, close enough that they knew which child to deliver it through. The room held that for a moment. Mateo stood up again. He walked to the door. He stood facing it without opening it. I'm going to ask you one more question, Mateo said. His voice was very quiet. And you're going to tell me the truth. Not the truth you've been managing. The truth. Yes, Carmine said. Is there anything else you know about Forsyth's plan that you haven't told me? 6 seconds. He has a secondary target, Carmine said. Beyond the documentation. Beyond the asset frame. Another pause. Elena, specifically Elena's history with the organization. Whatever she knew during the marriage conversations, names, locations. Forsyth believes she retained it. He wants it. And if she won't give it willingly... Mateo turned around. Carmine met his eyes. He's going to take one of the children, Carmine said, and use them as a request. Mateo called Elena at 9:14. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she was awake, which meant she was already living in the particular alertness of someone whose instincts had been telling her something was wrong. Get the children and get out of the apartment, Mateo said. Now, don't pack, don't explain. Just move, a beat. One beat, which was all Elena Marlowe allowed herself before she was already moving. He could hear it in the background, her feet on the floor, a light switch, her voice low and urgent in the direction of the bedrooms. Where, she said. He gave her an address. A property that existed under a name connected to nothing in his organization, purchased 6 years ago by an entity that had since been dissolved. The kind of clean shelter that took years to build correctly, and that he had built specifically because a man in his position needed places that no one else could find. He had never told Carmine about it. He had never told anyone. 40, he said, don't take your car. Walk to the corner named the street. There'll be a black SUV. The driver's name is Marco. He knows you're coming. Mateo. Her voice was controlled, but he could hear the effort it was taking. How serious? Serious enough, he said. I'll explain everything when you're inside. Go, she went. He stood in the storage building for 2 more minutes looking at Carmen. He said the words he had not said to anyone in 14 years. You're done, Mateo said, not because of the mistake. Because of the 6 weeks. Carmine nodded. He had known this was coming. The nod had no performance in it. I'm going to need everything you have on Forsyth's network before you go, Mateo said. Everything. Tonight. And then you walk away from this organization and this city. Whatever agreement we had, it's dissolved. You live your life, and I don't look for you, and you don't surface anywhere near anything I've built. Understood, Carmine said. If you surface, Mateo said, I'll assume you made a different choice, and I'll treat it accordingly. Understood, Carmine said again. He pulled a drive from his coat pocket and set it on the table. He had brought it. He had already known this meeting ended this way, and he had prepared for it. And in that preparation there was something that was not quite absolution, but was at least the shape of a man trying to pay what he owed. Mateo picked it up. He left first. Elena and the children were inside the property by 10:45. Mateo arrived 11 minutes later. The property was a row house on a quiet street, interior updated but exterior unremarkable, the kind of place that collected no attention and offered no visible reason for anyone to look twice. Elena was in the kitchen when he came in, standing at the counter with her arms crossed, and her face doing everything at once, the fear she was managing, the anger she'd earned, the specific exhaustion of a woman who had spent 8 years building a life around the premise that she had gotten far enough away. The children were in the back room. He could hear Nico's voice and Theo's quieter one, and Lila saying something sharp and brief that ended the argument. Elena looked at him. Tell me, she said, he told her. Not everything, not Carmen, not the full shape of what 6 weeks of silence had cost. But the essential truth, Forsyth the plan, the secondary target. The fact that someone had been adjacent to the school. The fact that the bruise on Nico's jaw had not been an accident of schoolyard cruelty, but a deliberate delivery. Elena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she stood very still for a moment. Then she turned to the counter and pressed both palms flat against it and stared at the surface and breathed. "You told me 2 weeks," she said. "I know. You told me there wasn't an immediate threat." "I was wrong," he said. "I'm telling you now." She turned around. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing," he said. "I need you to stay here with the children until I resolve this." "How long?" "I don't know." "I don't know," he said. "I'm not going to give you a number that's wrong again." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, the working through of something, the specific calculation of a woman who has been managing alone for 8 years, deciding how much of that management she can afford to release. "What happened to Carmen?" she said. He looked at her. "You came in without him," she said. "You've never operated without him present in a crisis." "Not once in the years I knew you." Her eyes were steady. "What happened? He's gone," Matteo said. Elena absorbed this. "He was part of it," she said. "Not a question. He was careless in a way that cost us," Matteo said. "And then he managed the cost instead of disclosing it." "That stopped. That's done." She nodded once. "Who do you have left?" "Enough," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the one I have right now." She looked at the ceiling briefly. Then at him. "Nico's going to figure out something's wrong within the hour." "He always does. And when he does, he's going to ask me directly, and I don't lie to my children." "Tell him we're being careful," Matteo said. "That's true." "What do I tell him about why?" Matteo looked toward the back room. Nico's voice had gone quieter, which, he was learning, meant the boy was listening rather than talking. "Tell him his father made some enemies a long time ago, and we're making sure those people can't get close." Elena studied him. "You're asking me to explain you to your son." "Yeah," he said. "I know that's not fair." "No," she said. "It's not." But there was something in her voice that was not quite accusation. Something that recognized the shape of the situation, without pretending it was something other than what it was. "Go do what you need to do." He went. The drive back was 31 minutes, and he used them. The data on Carmine's drive was more complete than he'd expected. Either Carmine had been preparing it for a while, or the scope of what Carmine had uncovered in 6 weeks of independent investigation was genuinely extensive. Matteo went through it on his phone while Marco drove, and by the time they reached the office, he had a clearer picture of Forsyth's network than he'd had an hour ago. Forsyth had 4 primary nodes, Reese as the internal source, Pruitt as the external interface, a logistics contact named Vega, who controlled the church through which the framing documentation would travel, and a 4th node that the drive identified only as a contact with federal adjacency, someone with a connection to a federal investigation that was currently in a preliminary phase, and which, if Forsyth's documentation arrived at the right desk, would very quickly become a non-preliminary phase. 4 nodes. Matteo had dealt with more complex problems with fewer resources. But the clock was different now. Forsyth had been adjacent to the school for at least 3 weeks. He had people with knowledge of the children's routines, their schedule, the specific pattern of their days. And Forsyth, understanding by now that Matteo had found Reese and was moving toward him, would know that his timeline had compressed, which meant the action against the children was not a future contingency. It was an accelerated present. He called his attorney from the car. "I need the federal adjacency contact identified," he said. "The 4th node. I'm sending you what I have." "How fast?" his attorney said. "Yesterday," Matteo said. He sent the file. He thought about Forsyth's logic. A man with 3 years of planning and a network this structured did not take risks with his primary leverage. If the children were his request mechanism, the thing he would use to compel Elena's cooperation, then the move against them would be surgical. Not violent initially, a controlled extraction. Something that looked from the outside like a custody dispute or a voluntary departure until it was too late to characterize it otherwise. He needed to know where Forsyth was, not his address, his location in the timeline. How close to the move was he? He needed someone inside Forsyth's network who wasn't Reese. He thought about this for the remaining 7 minutes of the drive. Then he thought about Sabrina. He had not contacted Sabrina since the charity event. She had not contacted him, which was itself information the magazine piece had been released, and then nothing, no call, no message, the particular silence of someone who had deployed something and was waiting to see where it landed. Sabrina Vale was not a stupid woman. He had never made the mistake of thinking she was. She was strategic and self-preserving, and she had understood from very early in their relationship that Mateo's world operated on information and that proximity to him was a form of currency. What she had not understood or had understood and chosen to accept was that Pruitt had been using her proximity as an access point for something she may not have fully consented to. Or had she? He sat with that for a moment. He called her. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice was careful. Not surprised, or at least performing unsurprised with enough fluency that the distinction was difficult. "Mateo," she said. "I need to meet," he said. "It's late." "I know." A silence. He could hear her deciding. The specific quality of Sabrina's decision-making silences was different from Elena's, where Elena's were about honesty and its cost. Sabrina's were about position. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Tonight," he said. "An hour." "I'll come to you." Another silence. Shorter. "Fine," she said. Sabrina's apartment was in the Gold Coast, high enough to make the city look decorative. She met him at the door in what was clearly a deliberately assembled version of casual hair, clothes, the particular arrangement of a woman who had 40 minutes of warning and used them precisely. He noticed all of this and said nothing about it. She poured 2 glasses of wine. He didn't touch his. "You know why I'm here," he said. "I have an idea," she said. She sat across from him with her glass and her composure, and looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has been rehearsing for a version of this conversation. "Tell me about Pruitt," he said. Something moved in her face. Not guilt exactly. The cousin of guilt, the expression of someone who made a calculation they believed was acceptable, and is now being asked to defend it at a closer range than anticipated. "Gerald manages my career," she said. "He has for 4 years." "He manages more than your career," Mateo said. "He handles a range of—" "Sabrina." He said it without heat. "I'm not here to prosecute you. I'm here because 3 children are in a safe house tonight, because someone decided to use them as leverage, and I need to know how much you knew and when you knew it." She looked at her wine. The silence was long enough to be a confession. "I didn't know about the children," she said. "Not until the event. Gerald told me afterward. And before the event—" She turned the glass slowly. "Gerald told me that you had been moving assets, that you were trying to reposition, that someone had built a case that would give us—" She stopped. "Give him leverage if he needed it." "Give him," Mateo said. She looked up. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't understand what that meant." "What did you think it meant?" "I thought it meant that if you ended the relationship badly, there was something that I wouldn't be left with nothing." She set the glass down. "I didn't ask Gerald for specifics. I didn't ask who else was involved or what the full—" "You knew there was a plan," Mateo said. "You knew Pruitt was running it, and you allowed it to proceed." "I thought it was leverage," she said. She pressed her hands together. "I didn't know about children. I didn't know about abduction plans. I didn't know any of that." He looked at her for a long moment. He believed the part about the children. He did not entirely believe the part about the abduction plans. "Who is Forsyth?" he said. Sabrina blinked. The blink was genuine. The name had landed unexpectedly. "I don't know that name." "Gerald Pruitt's primary client," Mateo said. "The man whose network Pruitt runs. The man who has been building a case against my assets for 3 years." Sabrina shook her head slowly. "Gerald has clients I'm not introduced to. He keeps his business." "Think carefully," Mateo said. "Not about what you know, about what you've heard. A name, a reference, an offhand mention. Anything in the last year." She was quiet. He watched her going through it, genuinely searching, which was different from performing a search. Her eyes moved slightly left, which was the direction people's eyes moved when accessing actual memory rather than constructing a response. "Last spring," she said slowly, "Gerald had a dinner. I wasn't invited, but I was in the next room. I heard him on the phone, not a call, a confirmation. He said," she frowned, "he said something about the estate, that the access would be clean, that the timeline was Alan's call." Mateo went still. "The estate," he said. "That's what I heard." "Which estate?" he said. "Did he specify?" He said she was working to remember, the effort of it visible in the set of her mouth. He said the Deverio estate, and then he said the access would be clean when the systems were down. Mateo stood up. She looked up at him. Something in his expression made her sit straighter. "Mateo, don't leave this apartment tonight," he said. "Don't call Gerald. Don't tell him I was here." "What's happening?" she said. "I'm trying to stop something," he said. He was already moving to the door. The Deverio estate, the house outside the city, 32 acres, the place where the organization held its most essential functions, its most secure storage, its most deeply embedded infrastructure. The house where Matteo had spent the first half of his adult life building an empire room by room. He had moved Elena and the children to the safe house. He had told no one the address. He had told no one. But the estate was different. Its location was known. Its security systems were known to anyone who had ever worked inside the organization, and Forsyth had worked inside the organization for 8 years. Forsyth was not going to hit the safe house. He was going to use the estate as bait. Create a situation that forced Matteo to go there, a threat, a communication, something that required his physical presence, and then use the estate itself as the controlled environment. Matteo called Marco. "Get me to the estate," he said. "Now fast." "Which route?" Marco said, fast as Matteo said. "And call ahead to the security team, tell them full perimeter. Tell them not to open any access point until I'm physically present." "Yes," Mark said. The car was already moving. Matteo's phone buzzed. A message from a number he didn't recognize, 8 words. "We have the children. Come to the estate alone." He read it twice. He looked up from the phone. The safe house. No one had known the address. He had not told Carmine. He had not told his attorney. He had told Marco only the destination, not the address from which Elena was departing. Except he went back through it. He had called Elena from the storage building. He had given her the address of the safe house over the phone. And Carmine had been in the room. Carmine, who had said understood and yes and had placed a drive on the table with 6 weeks of information on it, had also been sitting in a room with concrete floors and bad acoustics when Matteo gave Elena the address of a safe house that no one was supposed to know. Matteo's hands were not shaking. He was aware of this in the specific way you become aware of your own body when it is doing something that surprises you, the absence of a physical response that should have been there, replaced instead by a cold, comprehensive clarity that was not calm but was what clarity looked like on the far side of a certain kind of shock. He called Marco. "Change of destination," he said. He gave the estate's address. He put the phone down. He sat in the back of the car and looked at the city going past the window and thought about Nico's voice in the back room of the safe house and Theo's and Leela saying something sharp that ended an argument, and standing at the kitchen counter with her palms flat and her face managing everything at once. He thought about Theo on the swing reading 2 sentences on the upswing. He thought about Leela's notebook and this word she had written under his name. Scared. But not for himself. He thought about Nico walking across a ballroom floor at 8 years old and introducing himself by the right name. Then he put all of it behind a wall where it would not affect what came next. He was going to the estate. He was going alone, because the message said alone, and because he needed whoever was there to believe, for at least long enough, that Matteo Deverio was walking in as the man he used to be, the man who solved problems through fear, who arrived with the weight of an organization behind him, who used power as his primary language. He was going to use that belief against them. And when it was done, the man who walked out the other side was not going to be the man who walked in. Because the man who walked in had an empire. The man who needed to walk out had something more important than that, and he was not going to get it by being who he had always been. The estate gates appeared in the headlights. The storm that had been threatening all evening broke open overhead, and the rain came down hard and sudden, and Marco slowed the car, and Matteo sat in the back with his phone in his hand and the 8 words on its screen and understood with perfect clarity that every decision he had made for 30 years had been leading to this specific moment, and that the outcome of it would determine not whether he survived, but who he would be if he did. He got out of the car. The rain hit him immediately. Cold, heavy, the kind that soaks through in seconds. He walked toward the gates, alone. The gates were open. That was the first wrong thing. The estate gates operated on a system that required 2 independent confirmations to release, and they were standing open in the rain like someone had propped them with the specific confidence of people who had already neutralized whatever was supposed to stop them. Matteo walked through. The gravel drive was 40 meters from the gate to the main entrance, and he covered it without hurrying, rain soaking through his coat in the first 15 seconds. And he used those 40 meters to read everything available to him. 3 ground floor lights on in the east wing, none in the west. The security booth at the inner perimeter was dark, which meant either the two men who staffed it were down or relocated. The camera above the main door was angled wrong, tilted 6 degrees off its calibrated position, which happened when someone physically redirected it rather than accessing the digital controls. Someone had been inside the security infrastructure before tonight. Not broken in, inside. With knowledge. Forsyth's 8 years. Mateo reached the main door and pushed it open and went inside. The entry hall smelled like the estate always smelled: old wood, the particular cold of a large house in November, something chemical underneath that was new and wrong, and that Mateo's hindbrain flagged before his conscious mind had finished cataloging it. Not gas, something else. The smell of equipment that had been recently activated. Jamming equipment. His phone was already dead in his pocket. He'd felt it go when he crossed the threshold, the specific absence of signal that wasn't the same as being out of range. They had prepared for him to call out. He moved through the entry hall without turning on lights, using the geography of a house he had lived in for 14 years. Left past the staircase through the corridor that connected the east and west wings, stopping at each doorway to listen before crossing it. He heard voices in the main room. 2, no 3. One of them higher than the others, and it took him 2 full seconds to understand why that registered differently. And when he understood it, his entire cardiovascular system did something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the specific animal response of a parent who hears a child's voice in a place a child should not be. They had not taken all 3. He could tell from the voice. One child, one voice. And it was not Nico. The pitch was wrong. The cadence was wrong. Too measured, too controlled for Nico's natural register. Theo. He pressed his back against the corridor wall and closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds and made himself process the implications without moving from instinct, because moving from instinct right now would get Theo killed, and that was not a sentence he was going to let become true. They had taken Theo from the safe house, which meant they had been in the safe house, which meant Carmen had given them the address in the time between leaving the storage building and Mateo's call to Marco, a window of approximately 40 minutes in which Carmen, who had said understood and nodded with no performance in it, had called Forsyth's people and given them everything. Not careless then. Not 6 weeks of excessive caution and a mistake made in the wrong direction. A decision. Mateo opened his eyes. He moved to the doorway of the main room and stopped with his back to the wall beside it and looked at the angle of light coming through the gap between the door and its frame. Then he looked at the reflection in the darkened window glass of the corridor. The angle was imperfect, but enough. Enough to see the main room's configuration. 4 people. Forsyth he identified immediately. He had a photograph from the drive, a man in his mid-50s with the particular build of someone who had been physically capable once and had replaced that capability with money. 2 others flanking him, security, not subtle about it. And at the far end of the room, on the couch that had been in the same position for 14 years, because Elena had placed it there, and Mateo had never moved it after the divorce, because moving it had felt like acknowledging something. Theo. Sitting on the couch with his jacket still zipped and his hands in his lap, and his face doing the thing Mateo recognized, the preternatural composure that was not absence of fear, but management of it. The same management that had allowed an 8-year-old to sit beside a stranger at a charity event and ask 7 careful questions before deciding tonight was enough. He was not restrained. He was simply there in the room, in the specific captivity of a child who understands that running is not the right move and is waiting for a better option to present itself. Mateo looked at his son through a corridor window's imperfect reflection. He counted the positions, the distances, the angles. Then he went in. He pushed the door open and walked into the main room with his hands visible and his coat soaked and his face doing nothing at all. Forsyth turned. Up close, he was smaller than the photograph suggested. Not physically, the build was accurate, but in the way that people who operate entirely through intermediaries are always smaller when the intermediaries are absent. He had the eyes of someone who had spent 3 years imagining this moment, and was now discovering that imagined confrontations never account for the actual weight of the other person in the room. "You came alone," Forsyth said. "You said alone," Mateo said. "I didn't think you'd actually—" "Where are the other 2?" Mateo said. Not loud, precise. Forsyth blinked.
"My other children."
"Where are they?" Forsyth's expression shifted. Something that was supposed to look like control but was assembling itself a half second too slowly. They're safe. As long as this conversation. If you tell me they're safe, Mateo said, still at the same volume, I'm going to need you to be specific about what safe means and where they are. Because safe is a word people use when they want to avoid saying something more precise. Forsyth looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the two men flanking him. The look was a mistake. It was the look of a man checking whether his support was still in position, and it told Mateo everything he needed to know about the actual hierarchy in the room. Forsyth was confident from a distance and less confident at 3 meters, with the subject of his 3-year plan standing in front of him, soaking wet and not performing any of the behaviors the plan had apparently projected. Nico and Lila are at a secondary location, Forsyth said, with people who have instructions to keep them comfortable as long as this resolves quickly. And if it doesn't resolve quickly, I'd prefer not to test that, Forsyth said. Mateo looked at him. Let the silence sit there for exactly as long as it needed to. Alan, he said. The first name landed differently than Forsyth's smaller, more precise, the particular diminishment of a name used by someone who knew you when you were still becoming what you were trying to be. You worked for me for 8 years. Forsyth's jaw tightened slightly. I worked, Forsyth said, in a position you kept deliberately limited for 8 years. Deliberately. You knew what I was capable of, and you kept me exactly far enough from the center that I couldn't threaten you. His voice had shifted, still controlled, but something underneath it had come forward, something that had been waiting a long time to be said at the right range. I built 3 of the logistics channels that are still running. I structured 2 of the account frameworks that became the foundation of your legitimate holdings. And you walked me to the door with a severance package and a conversation about how the organization was evolving. You left voluntarily, Mateo said. I left because staying meant spending another decade being exactly as useful as you needed me to be, and not a millimeter more, Forsyth said. And I decided 3 years of preparation was preferable to that. From the couch, Theo made a sound. Not distress. A very small, controlled sound. This was sound from someone repositioning, shifting slightly on the cushion, the rustling of a jacket zipper. Mateo didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Forsyth, and he kept his face completely still, because looking at Theo right now would tell Forsyth exactly where the lever was, and the lever's position was the only advantage Mateo currently had. What do you want? Mateo said. Forsyth tilted his head slightly. I want the legitimate holdings, the logistics infrastructure, the security company, the 3 distribution frameworks. Signed over cleanly, not under duress, not in a form that creates a legal trail that comes back. A genuine transfer, and the documentation you built. Disappears, Forsyth said. Clean break. You walk away with your family and whatever liquidity isn't tied to the holdings, and I take the infrastructure and the federal contact goes back to sleep, and nobody's children spend any more time in secondary locations. Mateo held his gaze. You built this, Mateo said, to take a logistics company. I built this, Forsyth said, to take what I built. With interest. You didn't build it, Mateo said. You built components. I built the structure those components operated inside. There's a difference. Have this argument with me in 5 years, Forsyth said, when I've had the structure long enough to know it better than you do. Now we're discussing terms. Mateo looked at him. Then he looked briefly, deliberately at Theo. Theo was watching him. Not frightened. Tracking. The same tracking he'd done at the charity event. The same quality of patient attention that had led to 7 careful questions and a judgment reserved for later. Theo's eyes moved from Mateo's face to the 2 men behind Forsyth and back. Then, barely perceptibly, Theo looked at his own jacket pocket. Mateo returned his eyes to Forsyth. I need to use the bathroom, Mateo said. Forsyth stared at him. What? I drove 40 minutes in a rainstorm, Mateo said. I need to use the bathroom. It's down the hall. I'll leave the door open. You can post one of your people at the entrance. Forsyth looked at him with the expression of a man trying to determine whether this was a tactic or a genuine biological request, which was exactly the expression Mateo needed him to have, because the uncertainty cost, time and time, was the only currency he was currently generating. 2 minutes, Forsyth said. 1 is fine, Mateo said. He walked to the corridor. One of the security men followed to the bathroom doorway. Mateo went inside, left the door open as promised, and stood at the sink and turned the cold water on. He looked at his own face in the mirror, soaked, the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. The jaw that Nico had inherited and Lila had catalogued, and Theo watched with those ancient eyes. He had 30 seconds. He used them. When he turned the water off and walked back to the main room, he had a cleaner map of what came next, not a plan, exactly, because plans required more variables than he currently controlled. But a sequence, a direction, the specific clarity that comes when you stop trying to manage an outcome and start working with what's actually in front of you. He sat down, not standing sitting, in the chair across from Forsyth, which put him at the same physical level, and removed the posture of confrontation that standing had maintained. Forsyth registered this shift and couldn't quite read it, which was the point. "Tell me about the federal contact," Mateo said. Forsyth frowned. "Why?" "Because if we're doing this cleanly, I need to know whether the contact goes back to sleep because you tell them to, or because the case against me genuinely closes. Those are different things." Forsyth studied him. "Why does it matter if the outcome is the same?" "Because I'm going to be living without your leverage afterward," Mateo said. "And I want to know the shape of what I'm living in." A pause. Then Forsyth said, "The contact is a preliminary investigator, not a case agent. The material I have gives them a reason to look at, doesn't give them a case. If the material doesn't reach them, they have no direction. And if the material reaches them anyway," Mateo said. "Independent of you." Forsyth's eyes narrowed. "It won't." "How certain are you of that?" "Certain enough." "Because you control every copy," Mateo said. "Not a question. You and Pruitt and Reese and Vega. 4 points of control. You're certain all 4 are holding." Something moved in Forsyth's expression. The particular flicker of a man whose certainty has just been reminded it has specific architecture. "Yes," Forsyth said. "Danny Reese has been under surveillance for 48 hours, Mateo said. His calls have been logged and copied. The call he made, Wednesday evening 19 minutes, to a front number that recording is currently in the possession of my attorney, who is not in this building and is not reachable by any of the 4 channels you control." Forsyth went still. Gerald Pruitt's financial instruments, the shell accounts, the connection to your hold structures, those were documented by my team before tonight. The documentation is also with my attorney. Mateo kept his voice at the same level throughout. The same even, precise register. "Vega I picked up 2 hours ago. He's talking. He does that people who run logistics channels are generally more interested in continuing to run logistics channels than in defending principals who didn't tell them what they were actually running." Forsyth's jaw was tight. "You have the same 4 points of control," Mateo said, "that you had this morning. But 3 of them are already compromised. And the 4th," he paused, "is the federal contact who is about to receive a very specific package from my attorney that explains exactly what Forsyth, Pruitt, and Reese were doing with a preliminary investigation and why the appropriate next step is to look at them rather than at me." "You're bluffing," Forsyth said. "Maybe," Mateo said. "Do you want to find out?" The security man on Forsyth's left shifted his weight. A small movement, almost nothing, but it was the movement of someone recalculating, checking the position of their exit, measuring the distance between where they were standing and where the situation was going. Forsyth saw it too. His composure was still in place, but it was costing him now. Mateo could see the cost in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands had moved from the casual position they'd been in, when Mateo entered to something tighter, more deliberate. "The children," Forsyth said. "You're forgetting the children." "I'm not forgetting them," Mateo said. "I'm telling you that what you have is a hostage situation, which is a different category of problem than a business negotiation, and that the window in which a hostage situation resolves in the hostage taker's favor is significantly narrower than you've apparently planned for." "You came alone," Forsyth said. "I came in alone," Mateo said. Forsyth looked at him. Outside, something changed. Not a sound, exactly a shift in the quality of the silence outside the estate's walls, the particular absence that precedes the presence of organized people in a coordinated position. Marco had not gone home. Marco had never gone home. Marco had been with Mateo for 11 years, and in those 11 years, come alone had never once meant come without a contingency. "The system is being restored right now," Mateo said. "The jamming is being overridden. In approximately 4 minutes, this building is going to have external communication restored, at which point the men you brought with you are going to have a choice between a clean exit and a complicated one, and I am going to strongly suggest they take the clean one." Forsyth stood up. The other children, he started, are at Elena's apartment building, Mateo said. Your secondary location team made 2 cell calls in the last hour from within 4 blocks of that building. Both calls trace back to the same front structure your logistics channel uses. My attorney has both call records. The building has been approached by my people in the last 30 minutes. He looked at Forsyth directly. They're already out. It was not entirely true. 50% of it was true. The call records were real. The building identification was real. The approach was in motion. Whether the children were physically out was something Mateo would not know for another 6 minutes, and that 6-minute gap was the part of this that was killing him from the inside with no visible external evidence. But Forsyth did not know it wasn't true, and Forsyth had built his leverage on the assumption that Mateo would behave like a man defending his empire, reactive, territorial, moving from the center outward. He had not built it for a man moving from the children outward. Forsyth looked at the 2 security men. The one on the left, the one who had shifted his weight, looked back at Forsyth with the very specific expression of a man who is employed rather than committed, and who has just received enough information to make a clear employment decision. Alan, Mateo said quietly, the first name again, same weight. I'm going to need you to tell me where Theo's siblings are. Exactly, right now. You said you already know, Forsyth said. I said I identified the building. I didn't say I had them. Exactly. Right now. Or the package goes to the federal contact tonight and you defend your 3 years of preparation from a position that has just become significantly less comfortable. Forsyth stared at him. His jaw worked. Then he gave an address. Mateo texted it to Marco from a second phone, not the jammed one, a secondary he'd kept in his inside pocket rather than his coat, because the coat was the obvious search point, and Mateo had been learning from people who wanted to control him for long enough to know where they looked first. The response came back in 40 seconds. Confirmed. Moving, he looked at Forsyth. The documentation, Mateo said. Every copy. Every derivative. Tonight. And in exchange, Forsyth said, and his voice has had a quality now that was stripped of the architecture he'd arrived with the 3 years, the planning, the certainty, and what was underneath was the voice of someone who had miscalculated in the specific way that only becomes visible at the moment of execution. In exchange, Mateo said, I don't hand what I have to the federal contact before you have time to get clear. That's the exchange. That's what's on the table, Mateo said. You wanted a business negotiation. I'm telling you what the business is. Forsyth looked at the room, the security men, the corridor, the window against which the rain was still coming down hard, the couch where Theo had been sitting. The couch was empty. Mateo did not allow himself to look for Theo. He kept his eyes on Forsyth. But in his peripheral vision, he had tracked the small movement during the negotiation Theo, silent and deliberate, sliding off the couch cushion and moving along the far wall toward the corridor door, using the conversation as cover the way a child who had been watching adults his entire short life knew how to use available noise. Theo had gotten out. Mateo didn't know where he'd gone or how far he'd gotten, but the pocket Theo had glanced at during that brief wordless exchange contained what Mateo had given him in the 30 seconds at the bathroom sink, not a phone, because the jamming covered phones. A radio transmitter, small, analog, the kind that operated on a frequency that jamming equipment at this commercial grade didn't cover because almost no one used analog transmission anymore. Almost no one. Marco used it, had used it for 11 years. Theo had pressed the transmit button at some point in the last 8 minutes, and Marco had heard the cure signal, and the position triangulation on the transmitter would have confirmed the estate location within 90 seconds. Which was why the outside silence had changed. Which was why Mateo had been buying time with a negotiation that was partly real and partly the specific architecture of a man keeping an adversary's attention on the wrong thing. The security man on the left made his decision. He put his hands up slowly, clearly, the practiced gesture of someone communicating, I'm exiting this situation, and am not a threat, and he walked to the corridor door and through it, and Mateo heard his footsteps on the entry hall floor, and then the front door, and then rain. The second security man looked at Forsyth. Forsyth looked at Mateo. The documentation, Mateo said. You'll use it anyway, Forsyth said. Even if I hand it over. You'll use what you have, and I'll use what I have to close the case against me, Mateo said. That requires demonstrating that the documentation you built was fabricated, which means demonstrating how it was built and by whom, which means your name is in it regardless. He held the man's eyes. What I'm offering is that your name is in it as the origin of a fraud that has already been resolved, rather than as the origin of a kidnapping and an act of extortion. Those are different conversations with different outcomes. Forsyth absorbed this. Where's the boy? Forsyth said. Gone, Mateo said. Forsyth looked at the empty couch. The second security man made his decision slower than the first. He followed the same path hands up. Corridor, entry hall, door, rain. Then it was just Forsyth and Mateo in a room with 14 years of wood and cold air and the smell of a house that had once been the center of something. The documentation, Mateo said for the third time. Forsyth reached into his jacket. Mateo's hand moved not to a weapon, because he wasn't carrying one, but into a position. An instinctive repositioning of weight, the body's preparation for the space between one moment and what came after it. Forsyth produced a phone. He held it out. Encrypted server, he said. That's the access, all copies. I can't delete it from here, you need a system. I have a system, Mateo said. He took the phone. Pruitt's copies. I'll contact him. You'll contact him in front of me, Mateo said. Right now, Forsyth made the call. Mateo listened to it. Short, specific, the clipped conversation of two people who understood that their shared structure had just changed shape. Pruitt was quiet for most of it. At the end, he said one word and disconnected. Outside, the perimeter changed again. Marco's team was inside the gates. Forsyth heard it. He stood in the middle of the main room of the DeVario estate and looked at Mateo with an expression that was not entirely what Mateo had expected, not rage, not the cornered desperation of someone whose plan has collapsed. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who had spent 3 years on a single project and had arrived at its conclusion and was still not entirely sure where the miscalculation had been. You really came alone, Forsyth said. I came in alone, Mateo said again. There's a difference. You were bluffing about Vega. Partially, Mateo said. Which part? The part where he's talking, Mateo said. He's in custody. Whether he's talking is a question for tomorrow. Forsyth looked at him for a long moment. The children, he said. I wasn't going to the secondary location was a precaution. They weren't going to be harmed. I know, Mateo said. Forsyth blinked. You know. You're not a violent man, Alan, Mateo said. You're a structural man. You build things. You built a very good structure over 3 years. The problem with structures built around a single leverage point is that when the leverage moves, the structure becomes just a building. He looked at the room around them, the estate, the house, the 14 years. I know something about that. Forsyth said nothing. Marco came through the door. Behind Marco, the estate was already filling with the controlled movement of people who'd been waiting outside in the rain for the duration of a negotiation they couldn't hear, operating on a signal from an 8-year-old with an analog transmitter in his jacket pocket. Mateo turned toward the corridor. He was soaked. His hands were completely steady. His chest was doing something that had no clinical name and that he was going to allow himself to process later in a different room when 3 children were confirmed in the same physical space as their mother. He said, Sir, Marco said. The children, Mateo said. 10 minutes out, Marco said. All 3, Elena's with them. Mateo stopped walking. He stood in the corridor of the estate with rain coming in through the open front door and the sounds of his remaining people moving through the building and the distant noise of the storm, and he pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum and breathed. Once, twice. Then he walked to the front door and stood in the opening and looked at the rain and waited for the headlights that were 10 minutes away from being the most important thing he had ever watched arrive. When they came, 2 of them, Marco's backup vehicle, moving fast up the gravel drive, he walked toward them. The back door opened before the car stopped. Theo came out first. He was soaked from wherever he'd ended up outside the transmitter move, had required him to exit through the rear corridor, which Mateo had not explicitly told him to do, which meant Theo had assessed the situation and made that decision himself at some point during the negotiation, and the fact of that was going to take Mateo a significant amount of time to fully process. Theo walked straight to him. He didn't run. He walked, the same deliberate pace as always, and he stopped in front of Mateo and looked up at him with those ancient eyes, still managing whatever he'd been managing in that room for the last hour, and then he said very quietly, I pressed it 3 times. Was that right? That was right, Mateo said. Theo nodded. The second car door opened. Nico came out at actual speed, the speed of someone who had been told to stay calm and had agreed to stay calm and was now technically no longer required to stay calm and was therefore done staying calm. He covered the distance between the car and Matteo in approximately 4 steps and hit him at waist height and grabbed his coat with both hands and didn't say anything, which from Nico was louder than anything he could have said. Matteo put one hand on the back of Nico's head. He kept his face level. He was not going to do what was happening in his chest in the middle of a gravel driveway in front of his people. He would do it later. Lila got out of the car last. She was holding her notebook. She had held it through the entire secondary location, apparently, because she had it in her hand and it was dry, which meant she had kept it inside her jacket the way Theo kept his book. And the fact that she had held onto that notebook through whatever had happened at the secondary location told Matteo something about his daughter that he was going to spend a long time sitting with. She came over. She looked at him with the same inventory expression she'd used at the charity event, at the park, at the common room. Taking stock, cataloging. Then she opened the notebook to the section with his name. She drew a line under the last entry. She wrote one word beneath it. She showed it to him. Stayed. He looked at his daughter. She closed the notebook and tucked it back under her arm. Elena came around from the other side of the car. She had been in the back between the two boys, which he knew because that was exactly where Elena would have positioned herself between them, not at the edge. She was soaked too, from the secondary location, and her face was doing everything it had been doing at the kitchen counter 2 hours ago, but stripped now of the management, the composure shredded by 2 hours of not knowing, and what was underneath was something raw and exhausted and furious, and something else that she hadn't shown him since the terrace at the charity event. She walked to him. She stopped 18 inches away. She looked at him, at the soaked coat, at Nico still holding his coat with both hands, at Theo beside him, at the estate behind him, with its open door and the activity inside it. She looked at his face. Everyone, he said. Everyone is... I know, she said. Marco told me. Not right now, she said. Her voice was very controlled. The control was costing everything she had left. Whatever you need to say right now, not in front of them. Not tonight. He looked at her. Okay, he said. She reached past him and put her hand on Nico's shoulder, not pulling him back. Just contact. The specific touch of a mother making sure her child is physically continuous. Nico let go of Matteo's coat but didn't move away. The rain kept coming. The 5 of them stood in the driveway of the estate in the rain, and Matteo looked at his children and the woman who had raised them and thought about the 3 years. Forsyth had spent building a structure around a leverage point, and the 8 years Elena had spent building something without any of the materials he'd had access to, and the specific difference between those 2 projects and what each of them had produced. Forsyth had built to take. Elena had built to protect. And what Elena had built was standing in a driveway in the rain, soaked and furious and whole, while what Forsyth had built was being disassembled room by room inside a house that was no longer the center of anything. Marco appeared at Matteo's elbow. The federal contact, he said quietly. Your attorney says the package is ready. Your call on timing. Matteo looked at Elena. She met his eyes. She gave him a small, barely perceptible nod. Tonight, Matteo said to Marco. Marco went back inside. Nico looked up. His jaw had that set. Is it done? Matteo looked at his son. Almost, he said. What's left? Nico said. Matteo held his gaze for a moment. Me, he said. The federal package went out at 11:47 that night. Matteo's attorney delivered it digitally and physically 2 channels, simultaneous. The redundancy of a man who had learned that single points of failure were the architecture of people who believed they controlled more than they did. The package contained the Reese call recordings, the Pruitt shell account documentation, the trace connection between Forsyth's holding structures and the preliminary investigation, and a sworn statement from Vega, who had in fact begun talking the moment he understood that Forsyth's network was already in collapse and that his choice was between being inside that collapse or outside it. Forsyth was in federal custody by 2 in the morning. Pruitt surrendered through his attorney at 6. Reese attempted to leave the city and was stopped at O'Hare at 4:45, which was a miscalculation so elementary that Matteo's attorney said it with something close to disappointment. Carmine was not found. Matteo had made a decision about that in the car on the way back from the estate. Sitting in the dark, with 3 children pressed against him in various configurations, Nico against his left side, Theo against his right, Leela in the middle seat between him and Elena, with her notebook in her lap and her head eventually dropping onto Elena's shoulder. He had decided in that car that finding Carmine was a project for another time, and possibly for someone else. What Carmine had done was a betrayal of the specific kind that came from a man trying to fix his own mistake and making it catastrophically worse. And Matteo had made enough of those errors himself in the past decade to understand the difference between a man who caused damage out of malice and a man who caused damage out of panic. He did not forgive it, but he let it go. For now. The children slept that night at the safe house, which had been swept and confirmed clean before they returned. Eslena sat in the kitchen while Matteo walked the perimeter himself, not because Marco's team hadn't already done it, but because he needed to do it, needed the physical action of checking each window and each door himself before he could allow himself to sit down. When he came back to the kitchen, Elena had made tea she wasn't drinking. They sat across from each other. The house was quiet except for the rain, still working itself out against the windows and the occasional sound from the back room's Nico talking in his sleep, which Elena said he had always done, a fact about his son that Matteo filed alongside all the other facts about his children that he was still learning. "Tell me what I don't know," Elena said. He told her about Carmine. He told her about the 6 weeks, the channel, the address of the safe house delivered through a phone call that Carmine had been present for. He told her plainly and completely, the same way he'd told her about Forsyth on the night he'd called her to run, and she listened the same way without interrupting, without performing her reaction, processing it in real time at the pace that the information required. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long did you trust him?" she said. 14 years, Matteo said. She nodded slowly. "And you didn't see it?" "I saw what he showed me," Matteo said, "which is what you do with people you trust. You stop looking for what they're not showing." Elena turned her teacup once. "Is that what you did with me? During the marriage?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "she absorbed that." "And Sabrina's. With Sabrina, I saw exactly what she showed me," he said. "That was the problem. She showed me something easy, and I chose easy because I was tired of the work that real things require." He held her gaze. "That's not her fault. It's mine." Elena looked at him for a long moment. She picked up her tea and finally drank some of it. "Pruitt is going to try to deal," she said. "He'll offer information on Forsyth's other connections. The federal people will want to know about the 3 years of network building." "Yes," Matteo said, "and your name comes up in that." "Yes," he said again. "My attorney is managing the shape of it. The repositioning of assets, done correctly, and it was done correctly. Whatever Forsyth tried to build around it holds up. The documentation Forsyth created was fabricated. That's provable now. My involvement is as the subject of an extortion, not as a participant in anything criminal." He paused. "There are things from before the repositioning that have a different character. My attorney is negotiating those separately." "Negotiating," Elena said. "Disclosing," he said. "There's a difference. I'm not trading names for immunity. I'm giving the federal investigators a complete picture of the specific operations I was responsible for and accepting whatever follows from that picture." Elena set down her cup. She looked at him with an expression that was not surprise, but was something close to recalibration. "That's going to cost you," she said. "Yes," he said. "How much?" "Some of the legitimate holdings," he said. "The ones that were capitalized from operations that can't be cleanly separated from their source." "Not all of it. My attorney thinks 2 of the 3 frameworks survive intact." He paused. "Enough to build something from." "And the estate?" Elena said. He looked at her. "The estate is part of what goes," he said. She nodded once, not with satisfaction, not with grief. With the nod of someone receiving a piece of information and placing it correctly. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. "What happens now?" she said. Not to him specifically. The question aimed at the general shape of what came next. "I'm going to spend the next several months in rooms with attorneys and federal investigators," he said. "It won't be clean or fast. At the end of it, what I have left is the security company and one of the logistics frameworks and whatever I've built my way back toward by then." "And the children," Elena said. He looked at her directly. "I want to be their father, not a presence in their lives, their father. Whatever that looks like, whatever structure we build around it, whatever I have to earn to make it work. I want to be in the room. Elena held his gaze for a long moment. You know, Lila wrote stayed in her notebook tonight, she said. I saw, he said. She's been writing left in it for 8 years, Elena said quietly. Not about you specifically, about what the absence meant. She started the notebook when she was 5. She never told me what the first section said, but I found it once. She looked at her cup. The first section was called Things That Go, and it was a list of what she'd noticed leave. A neighbor, a teacher she liked, her friend's father. A pause. She filed absence before she had a word for what she was cataloging. Mateo was very still. She needed to name it, he said. She needed to prepare for it, Elena said, so it would hurt less when it happened again. He looked at the table, at his own hands. I'm not going to leave, he said. I know you believe that, she said. Not cruel, not doubting. Just the precision of a woman who had learned the difference between a man's intention and a man's follow-through, and who could not yet afford to treat them as the same thing. I know it's not enough to say, he said. No, she said. It's not. They sat with that. Outside, the rain had finally thinned to something lighter, the storm working through its last energy, and the kitchen held the specific quiet of 4 a.m, the hour where what is real and what is manageable occupy the same space without pretending to be the same thing. I'm not asking you to take me back, Mateo said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not sitting here with a version of what comes next that requires you to... He stopped. I'm asking to be Nico's father and Lila's father and Theo's father. Everything else is whatever you decide it is, in whatever time you need to decide it. Elena looked at him. She did not say anything immediately. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the terrace at the charity event, reading, measuring, distinguishing between what was being said and what was meant underneath it. And he sat under that look without managing it, without directing it, without the 30 years of discipline that usually built a wall between what he felt and what was visible. He let her look. After a moment, she said, "Go check on them." He went. The 3 of them were in the back room on 2 pushed-together beds. The room had only 1 bed. But Marco's team had found another somewhere in the house and moved it, which was the kind of problem-solving that Mateo had relied on for 11 years, and that he recognized now as the specific loyalty of people who had chosen him and continued choosing him without requiring him to acknowledge the choice. Nico was on his back with one arm thrown over his face, talking in his sleep in the low, rapid murmur that Elena had described. And Mateo stood in the doorway and listened to it for a moment, not words exactly. Just the sound of his son's brain working through something at 4 a.m, unguarded in the way that sleeping children are unguarded, without the chin set and the direct eye contact and the 8 years of self-reliance. Theo was curled on his side facing the wall, the book on the mattress beside him, where he'd apparently fallen asleep reading, and his breathing was slow and even and utterly unbothered, with the deep unconsciousness of someone who had expended enormous controlled effort over an extended period and had nothing left to manage. Lila was between them. She was awake. He saw it when he looked her eyes open in the dark, tracking him in the doorway with the same inventory attention she brought to everything. He didn't speak. He didn't want to wake the boys. He looked at her. She looked at him. Then she moved one hand from under her blanket and held it up briefly, palm-out fingers, slightly spread, not a wave. An acknowledgement. The gesture of someone confirming a presence. He pressed his hand flat against the doorframe. She lowered hers. She closed her eyes. He stood there for another 2 minutes, listening to 3 people breathe, and then he walked back to the kitchen. Elena was washing the teacups. He stood in the doorway and watched her do this ordinary thing in an unfamiliar kitchen at 4 a.m, with the specific efficiency of someone who cleaned as a way of managing what couldn't be managed. And he thought about all the kitchens he hadn't been in, all the ordinary things he'd missed, and he let himself think about it clearly, without the wall, because the wall was part of what had cost him, and he was done using it for anything except keeping things out that should be kept out. Elena turned and found him in the doorway. "They're asleep," he said. Lila was awake. "She always is," Elena said. "After something happens, she doesn't sleep for a while. She needs to process it first." "She just looked at me," he said, and then closed her eyes. Elena dried her hands. She looked at him with an expression that shifted slightly, something moving through it that was not quite what had been there 5 minutes ago. "That means she decided you were safe to sleep around," she said. He absorbed that. "That's her test," Alyssa said. "Not the notebook. Whether she can close her eyes in the same room as someone." He looked at the towel in her hands. "She did it in the car," he said. On the way here, she put her head on your shoulder and closed her eyes. She's been doing that since she was 18 months old, Elena said. She did it in the doorway just now, he said, knowing I was there. Asena set the towel down. She looked at him. Her face did several things in a short span of time, and he watched all of them because he had earned the right to watch them by not looking away, and because whatever moved through Elena Marlowe's face when she finally stopped managing, it was something he understood he had not seen clearly for a long time and was not going to waste now. She didn't say anything. She walked past him into the hallway, and he followed her, and she went to the small room at the front of the house where a lamp was still on, and she sat down on the couch there, and after a moment he sat beside her. Not close. A foot of space between them. The lamp made a warm circle, and outside the rain had stopped almost entirely, just occasional drops tapping the window with the randomness of something finishing rather than something falling. I need to tell you something, Elena said. Okay, he said. I came back to Chicago because of Theo's specialist, she said. That part was true, but it wasn't only that. She looked at her hands. I came back because Nico asked me, about 3 months before we moved, whether his father lived in Chicago. I told him I thought so. He said she paused. He said he wanted to be in the same city, even if they never met. He said it felt wrong to be that far away from someone who was half of where he came from. Mateo was quiet. He's 8, Elena said. I know, Mateo said. He said it the way he says everything, she said. Like it was already decided and he was just informing me. The ghost of something crossed her face. I moved a family of 4 across 2 states because my 8-year-old made a decision. You moved because you knew he was right, Mateo said. She looked at him. Don't make it simpler than it was. I'm not, he said. I'm saying you knew he was right, and you were afraid of what right meant, and you moved anyway. That's not simple. She was quiet. I was afraid, she said. Of this. Of being back in the same city, and eventually, because with Nico, eventually is always very quickly, eventually being back in your vicinity and not knowing what I'd feel. She looked at the lamp rather than him. I spent 8 years being certain about the decision I made. Being certain I'd done the right thing for the right reasons. And then I moved back to Chicago, and 3 weeks later my son found a charity invitation in my bag and asked if you'd be there. What did you feel? Mateo said. When you saw me crossing the room. She considered this. Like 8 years hadn't been long enough, she said. And also like they'd been exactly long enough. She turned to look at him directly. I know that doesn't make sense. It makes sense, he said. She held his gaze. What Sabrina was what she represented to you. I need you to say it out loud. Not for me, for you. He looked at the window. She was evidence, he said. That I'd made it, that what I'd built was real and significant and worth what it cost. She was the version of my life that looked the way power's supposed to look. He was quiet for a moment. And you were the version of my life that looked like what I actually was. Which was a man who was afraid that if he stopped moving long enough to be known, really known, what was there wouldn't be worth knowing. Elena said nothing. You saw me clearly, he said, and I couldn't tolerate it. So I chose someone who only needed to see the surface. He looked at her. That's the honest answer. She held his gaze for a long moment. You know what the hardest part was, she said, after. With the children. Tell me, Nico looks exactly like you, she said. Not just the face. The way he enters a room. The way he argues and then reconsiders and doesn't announce the reconsideration. He just shifts. I watched him do it when he was 4 years old, and I thought, her voice tightened slightly, and she let it, didn't manage it down. I thought, that's not mine. That came from somewhere he's never been, from someone he's never met, and it's just there. In him. Like you were there without being there. Elena, I'm not saying it to hurt you, she said. I'm saying it because you should know that they carry you. They've been carrying you the whole time. And whatever you thought the divorce settled, it didn't settle that. He sat with that, with the weight and the specific irreversibility of it. I know I can't recover what I missed, he said. I'm trying to earn what comes next. That's the right answer, she said. I just need you to understand that earning it takes longer than a crisis. A crisis is easy. She looked at him steadily. You were very good tonight. What you did at the estate, what you did with Theo, the transmitter, the negotiation. That was you being very good at the things you've always been good at. Yes, he said. What I need to see, she said, is whether you're good at the things you've never had to be good at. The school project at 10 o'clock at night. The argument about something small that feels enormous to an 8-year-old. The Tuesday. She paused. The Tuesday where nothing happens and you're just there. I know, he said. Do you? She said. No, he said. Not yet. But I know enough to know I don't know. She looked at him. Something in her face settled, not softening exactly, not the dissolution of everything the past 8 years had built into her, but a settling like a structure finding its actual foundation rather than the provisional one it had been balancing on. She didn't move toward him. He didn't move toward her. But the foot of space between them on the couch no longer felt like distance. It felt like the accurate measurement of where they were, which was different and more honest than where they'd been. The months that followed were not clean. Nothing about what Mateo had to do was clean or fast or uncomplicated, and he had not promised any of those things to anyone, which turned out to be the most important thing he could have not promised. The federal disclosure process took 4 months. There were 14 separate meetings with investigators, 3 with federal attorneys, one that lasted 11 hours and left him with the specific depletion of a man who has said every true thing he knows and has nothing left to protect. His attorney emerged from it, describing the outcome as the best available result under the circumstances, which was legal language for not nothing, not everything, but survivable. The estate was surrendered as part of a civil settlement. 2 of the 3 logistics frameworks survived intact, reorganized under a legal structure that his attorney had been quietly building for 3 years the same. 3 years Forsyth had spent building something to destroy it, a parallel construction that Mateo had never mentioned to Carmine, which was the specific luck of a man whose paranoia had been directionally correct even when the target was wrong. The security company became Deverio Protective Services, with the criminal components surgically excised and the legitimate operations expanded into the space that expansion made available. By the end of the first year, it had 17 contracts and 42 employees, and a reputation built not on fear, but on the more durable foundation of actually being good at the work. He hired 3 people who had worked for him in the old structure and who he trusted to make the transition. He did not hire anyone he was uncertain about. He had learned something about the cost of uncertainty managed quietly, and he was done paying that particular tuition. He moved into a house 12 blocks from Elena's apartment. Not close enough to impose. Close enough for the arrangement to be practical for the children to cover the distance on foot, for the logistics of a shared life to not require 2 hours of planning per interaction. The arrangement with the children was also not clean. Nico tested it constantly, not maliciously, that wasn't Nico's nature, which was direct and declarative rather than manipulative, but with the specific energy of someone who has been told a thing is true and needs to verify it in real conditions. He would agree to plans and then not show up. He would show up for something he'd said he didn't want to attend. He would argue with Mateo about something small until the argument became about something large, and then he would go very quiet, and then the next time he would be different, as if the argument had resolved something that he hadn't been able to name while it was happening. Mateo did not handle this perfectly. He lost his patience twice. Once over something that didn't merit losing his patience, and once over something that did, but where losing it didn't help. Both times he went back and said so, which was not natural for him, and which required the kind of practiced discomfort that had no shortcuts. Nico received both apologies with the same abrupt nod he used for everything, which Mateo learned to read as meaning, filed, acceptable, moving on. Lila updated her notebook. She showed it to him occasionally when she had decided a new entry was worth sharing. The section with his name grew slowly, entry by entry, the observations precise and often uncomfortably accurate. She added dates. She added question marks where she was uncertain. She crossed out 2 early entries after revising her assessment. He never asked her to show him anything. He waited for her to decide. By the 8th month, she had started a new subsection. She showed it to him on a Saturday afternoon when they were at the kitchen table, his kitchen, the first time she'd voluntarily come to his house for something other than a scheduled visit. The new subsection was titled Consistent. It had 11 entries. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. She was watching him with that inventory expression. "You're tracking consistency," he said. "Someone told me that's what matters," she said. "After the crisis." "Someone," he said. "Mom," she said. She closed the notebook. She said, "Crises are easy." She said, "Tuesdays are what matter." He looked at his daughter. "This is a Tuesday," he said. "Yes," Lila said. "That's why I came." She opened her notebook again and wrote something. She didn't show him that entry, but she didn't close the book either. She left it open on the table between them while they worked on her school project, which was about ecosystems, and which she had a great deal of opinions about, and Matteo listened to her opinions and offered some, and was told twice that his were incorrect, and once that they were interesting, which from Leela he had learned to treat as the higher praise. Theo came by on his own schedule, which was not the scheduled visits and not the spontaneous appearances that characterized Nico's pattern. Theo came when he had decided to come with his book and his questions, and the questions had shifted from the careful test questions of the park to something more expansive. He asked Matteo about the security company, not about the past, about the work itself, how it functioned, what problems it solved. He asked about logistics and structure and the way decisions move through an organization. He asked once with the same casual directness he brought to everything, whether Matteo regretted the years of the other kind of work. Matteo told him yes. Theo said, "What part?" Matteo thought about it. Really thought, rather than producing the expected answer. "The part where I convinced myself that the way I was operating was inevitable," he said. "That the structure required it. That there wasn't another way." He looked at Theo. "There was always another way. I just didn't look for it until I had a reason to." Theo was quiet for a moment. "The reason was us," Theo said. "Yes," Matteo said. "That's a late reason," Theo said. "Yes," Matteo said. "It is." Filed it. Opened his book. After a moment, without looking up, he said, "Better late than the other thing." "Yeah," Matteo said. "Better late." Elena came to his house for the first time on a Sunday in March. Not a scheduled visit. Not an arrangement. She came because Nico had left his jacket at Matteo's the day before and needed it for school Monday, and because she was nearby, and because the reason was small enough that crossing the threshold didn't require any of the architecture that larger reasons required. He opened the door. She was in her coat with the jacket over one arm, and she looked at him the way she had learned to look at him over the months, not with the 8 years, not with a charity event, but with the specific present tense attention of someone who was checking whether the person in front of them was who they'd found them to be the last time. He was. He stood back and she came in. She hadn't been inside before. She looked at the house, at the things he'd chosen for it, which were different from the estate, different from the deliberately impersonal house before, fewer and more considered, things that had a function or a history rather than a price point. She looked at the children's drawings on the wall beside the kitchen doorway, Lila's precise labeled diagrams, Nico's large aggressive color block pieces that were more energy than image, Theo's single drawing, detailed and small, of a bird he'd described to Matteo one afternoon in enough detail that Matteo had spent an hour looking it up afterward to see if it was real. It was real. Elena looked at the drawings for a moment. "Lila gave you the ecosystem one," she said. "Last week," he said. "After we finished the project." She turned. She looked at him with the present tense check. He stood still under it, and whatever she found was apparently consistent with what she'd found before. Because her expression settled in that way, it had been settling incrementally for months, not arriving anywhere dramatic, just releasing something. One small piece at a time. The way you release something you've been holding long enough that releasing it has to be done carefully rather than all at once. She put Nico's jacket on the chair by the door. She didn't leave immediately. She went to the kitchen and looked at the drawings again from that angle, and Matteo followed her. And they stood in his kitchen on a Sunday in March, and he made coffee, and she sat at the table where Lila had shown him the subsection called consistent, and they talked about nothing important. About Nico's school, about Theo's new book, which was about migratory patterns, in which he was reading alongside 2 others simultaneously in the way he did everything in parallel, cross-referencing. About Lila's teacher, who Lila had assessed as competent but methodologically limited, which was a phrase she had used at dinner, and which Matteo had needed a moment to process coming from a 9-year-old. 9. They had turned 9 in February. He had been there for the birthday. The first one. He had shown up with something he'd spent 2 weeks deciding on, not expensive, not performative, but right. One specific thing for each of them that required knowing who they were, and Nico had torn the wrapping off his in 4 seconds flat and immediately tried to use it incorrectly, and Lila had examined hers with the care of someone performing provenance verification, and Theo had held his for a long moment before looking up and saying, simply, "You paid attention." He had paid attention. He was paying attention. Elena drank her coffee. She looked out the kitchen window at the street, at the March light, which was thin and genuine, the first light of the year that remembered it was supposed to be warm. He asked me last week, she said, whether I thought you were staying. Matteo looked at her. Nico, she said. He was quiet. What did you tell him? He said. She turned from the window. She looked at him at the kitchen table, in the house he'd chosen to be 12 blocks from her, with 3 children's drawings on the wall and a coffee she'd accepted without him asking whether she wanted one, because by now he knew. I told him yes, she said. I think you're staying. He held her gaze. I am, he said. She nodded once. The nod that was not forgiveness, and not the erasure of 8 years, and not a promise about anything that came next, but was the specific acknowledgement of a woman who had learned to measure a person by what they did in the unremarkable hours, and who had been measuring and had arrived at a result. She looked at her coffee. He looked at her. The March light came through the window and lay between them, and the street outside was quiet. And somewhere in the 12 blocks between this kitchen and her apartment, 3 children were moving through a Sunday with the ordinary energy of children who did not currently need anything from either of them. He did not reach for her hand. She did not move toward him. They sat with the coffee and the light and the particular truth of 2 people who had broken something real and were learning, slowly and without guarantees, what could be built from what remained. She finished her coffee. She stood up. She picked up Nico's jacket from the chair. At the door, she stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She stood with her hand on the door and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something when you're deciding whether what you're about to say is the right time for it or whether the right time is later. She turned around. She looked at him across the hallway. The children were right, she said, from the beginning. They always believed you'd come back. He looked at her. I know, he said. They were right, she said again. Not repetition clarification. Saying it twice because the first time was about the children and the second time was about something else. He understood. She opened the door. The March light came in. She left. He stood in the hallway of his house for a while, with the light from the open door still present in the air, and thought about all the things that had led here, the decisions and the costs and the losses, and the specific long work of becoming someone who could be trusted with the life he'd almost thrown away entirely. Then he went back to the kitchen and washed the 2 cups and looked at the drawings on the wall and thought about Tuesdays. About the next one. About the one after that. About the ordinary, unremarkable, irreplaceable accumulation of days in which nothing happened except that he was there. That was what coming back meant, not the estate, not the organization, not the power or the fear or the room that went quiet when he walked in. 3 children who had carried him in his absence, and a woman who had built a life worth coming back to, and the Tuesday that was always coming, in which he would simply show up and be exactly who he had finally, at significant cost, learned to be. He was going to be there for it. Everyone. The end.